Ah, what a beautiful thing. Several little birds, and a blue sky. But everything is on fire in the background. Run people, run, run, because today there's a sale. Buy 3, pay 5. And in the middle of all this fire, there's a wicked angel singing, and his song is completely destroying the city around him. 2 girls in the background stared at it in fear, because that was a level 4 monster. The redhead told her friend to evacuate everyone while she went to fight. Actually, she was going to try to fight. She had never seen a level 4 enemy in front of her. She was still wrong that everything was fine and they had much more work ahead, because the National Intelligence Agency had managed to detect several portals appearing, and the redhead was the only level 3 awakened one in that area to fight. And the angel stared at her, and at that moment he ran toward her with a furious look. The redhead raised her hands, starting to conjure fire and telling her friend to leave, until a presence simply ordered them to get out of the way. And this being in black garments appeared right behind the redhead, and with a thunderous punch, struck that wicked angel in front of him. Both were completely perplexed, because this man destroyed a level 4 enemy with just one punch, and that monster began to turn into stone and dust right behind him, and he approached the 2 girls and smiled because they were human, then asked what year it was, and the redhead couldn't believe it and immediately asked his name. But upon seeing that completely hateful expression of this man, she felt fear and revealed that today was October 6, 2024, and he was surprised because only 1 year had passed. He had spent hundreds of years in hell, and only 1 year had passed out here. By the calculations, it was the worst possible moment, because exactly 1 year ago on this same day, he was leaving home but encountered the true realm of demons right ahead. It had been an extremely difficult and painful period, but after many victories, he managed to return to the human world. The girls observed that he had the power of an S rank, at least even higher than a government weapon. Maybe he was an envoy from the National Intelligence Service, and right beside him a large car came speeding in, and from behind several people got out, and the leader of that group ordered everyone to take battle positions. This was the leader Jungwoo Kim, who came to receive both Serena and Nuri, and apologized for leaving them behind and not arriving earlier, but asked where the enemy was while shaking his head from side to side. The girls were completely terrified when they heard one of his colleagues call our protagonist a cheap cosplayer who should just get out of there. Serena said that he should stop that immediately, until the protagonist said that he had only 3 seconds, and the guy didn't understand anything at all. It was 3 seconds to convince him to let him live, and at that moment, that guy felt a suffocating pressure and drew a small dagger. Who felt that suffocating pressure? But he must have been bluffing, right? Yet our protagonist had a completely violent aura, and the scarred extra charged at him with a storm of blades, but was completely stopped with just one finger from the protagonist, who flicked him away, sending him flying unconscious. That's because the 3 seconds had already passed, but Jungwoo Kim appeared to try to save his subordinate, yet the protagonist just told him to stop worrying because right above them, a new portal was opening. And by his calculation, the group's power wasn't enough to stop that portal, and a huge eye was seen. At that moment, all the members who arrived felt their hearts become completely heavy. Jungwoo Kim couldn't even look up. The pressure from that monster was incredible, because this was a level 6 enemy. Someone called the command center, saying they had a red horn right ahead, and the people at the center were completely terrified. The order was to summon all the awakened ones in the country to fight, because this was probably the greatest enemy in history to have appeared. He also ordered Serena and Nori to get out of there because they were too weak. That way the remaining members launched into pure aggression against that monster. Hey, the big beast really looked furious, fighting against everyone, and Nori grew restless while staring at the protagonist, asking if he could help them this time. But why should he? What was the point? Nori fell silent, but answered that this world was also his, and they needed his power to protect the others. But the protagonist was not convinced. He needed just one reason to help them. After all, the weak must be eliminated, and the strong must live. There were no exceptions to that. The strong ruled the world. After all, that was the hierarchy of power. Fighting to survive was the ideal, while one of the members was throwing a heavy blow at the monster, but they weren't enough, being completely wiped out along the way. And Nori, seeing all that blood spreading, was completely terrified. But the most important part for our boy was to know where Officer Xian's office was. But Nori just fell to her knees, completely powerless, and the protagonist just walked away from there, calling them useless, and Serena asked if he was really watching the same situation as they were. Then she called out to her friend because that guy wouldn't help them, but she wasn't okay with that. Then she started screaming because that wasn't what powerful people should do, and she drew 2 large swords from a portal. She was determined to fight too, because no matter how weak she was, she had the power to protect. And she was heading into battle, believing that the strong should protect the weak. And the protagonist just sighed at all that speech while that small girl charged at the monster. But she was quickly rejected by the brutal attack, and that monster grabbed her in midair with its mouth open, and the girl was already expecting to become its afternoon snack. But in that instant, an order was given to the monster that it should fall, and that monster obeyed, collapsing completely to the ground in immeasurable pain. No one could understand what was happening, and the protagonist caught that blonde girl in his arms, saying that she was quite interesting, and that he liked her a lot as he rescued her. Then he revealed that his name was Tha, or better known as her future lord, in this case the Demon Lord, and Nuri was completely speechless. What did he mean? A demon? And right behind them, that monster was rising again. It even opened its mouth to fire a magic blast in the direction of the protagonist. And Taerin just turned around, saying that this guy was making too much noise and how dare he open that mouth right in front of him. Then he struck the air, causing a massive blast, and at the same time sent that monster's face flying through the skies. That way its mouth was completely shut, and the big monster stayed there, calm. But Taerin didn't care at all. After all, he had dared to do that before, and then, with a snap of his fingers, he completely obliterated the existence of that level 6 monster, which was simply erased, falling to the ground. None of the people around could believe it. And Taerin was pleased, because now they were on the same level, looking eye to eye. Then he just raised his hands, and a kind of crystal was coming out from inside that monster. And at the moment he picked up that crystal, he liked it a lot because it shone beautifully. And Kim had never seen such a large magic crystal in his life, while Taerin just tossed it into a kind of dimensional rift that opened. But he kept staring, and didn't stop doing so. Then he just told her that she should follow him from now on. She was completely embarrassed, but Taerin simply stated that he wouldn't repeat himself a second time. She should follow him from now on, and there was no choice. And of course the girl was completely terrified by that. But Kim appeared in front, defending his subordinate. They thanked him for defeating that enemy, but they couldn't give up one of their own. And the protagonist simply said that he could do that. After all, he was powerful. He wasn't asking for anyone's permission, and ordered them to move aside. And the two who were protecting Nuri simply fell to the ground under tremendous pressure, suspicious and confused. They couldn't understand where that suffocating pain was coming from. Taerin was about to get rid of those insects, but Nuri stepped in front of them, telling him not to do that. She would follow him without complaint, but he shouldn't hurt the others. It wasn't as if that was a proposal for Tha. He didn't care much but widened his eyes, because that girl seemed quite special when several screens began to appear in front of him. That girl had 2 classes. It was like finding a precious gem in a vast desert, and in a way he was confident that she could evolve greatly as he extended his hands. That way he also invited her to hold his hands so they could go together. And the moment she touched Ty's hands, a great aura began to rise. She felt her body burning, but he soon told her not to worry, because this was the recording ritual, and it wouldn't be bad for her to receive that power. Thus, a great glowing pillar rose to the skies, and all around, no one understood what was happening, because a massive surge of power was forming in the center of the ruined city. Minutes later, Serena still didn't understand what had happened. Thus, the teams began to collect the bodies of the fallen, and heal those who had survived the battle, and soon someone approached Serena. It was hard to believe that a level 6 monster had appeared and been eliminated so quickly by a random guy. Even so, Serena wasn't that worried because that guy didn't seem evil, yet he was still looking for Officer Xian's office. And well, there was nothing they could do to stop him. After all, he was a monster. And on the other side, the protagonist. Nuri was heading toward that so-called office. Nuri was guiding him, and at least she remembered it was around that area. She wondered if she really should be doing that. Then she began typing some messages to send to the command center. But Tai Hiying quickly said that she had no need to report what was happening, and with the recording ritual, he could know exactly what she was thinking now. So anything she tried to do against him, he would be able to know. And from now on, there was nothing to be done. After all, she was his. She couldn't escape anymore. Then he simply ordered once again that she show the way, and the girl became completely sad about it. And I think anyone would feel sad if some random guy appeared claiming to be the Demon Lord, kidnapped you and made you his GPS to hunt things around. And Tai Hiying was worried about one thing, because even after spending hundreds of years walking through the infernos, he had never forgotten her, and from now on he was going to visit her. But Nuri pointed her finger, saying that he shouldn't get upset because they had arrived. This was Officer Xian's office. It was completely destroyed in ruins, and clearly Tai Hiying became completely enraged because that was what he had been looking for. On the other side, that large car was moving at high speed, and it seemed that the government team had managed to trace some information about that man. Tai had been a student before the Great Destructions, and he used to live inside Officer Xian's office. That is, she was definitely related to him. And the group burst into laughter because his grandmother used to call him little Tai Hiying baby. The guys just told Serena to stop laughing because she looked really weird doing that. But the strange part was that he had been just a student, not awakened. And one of the officers got scared when he remembered that in that same office, there had been a guild war. And he even put his hands on his head because it all seemed like a nightmare. On the protagonist's side, he was exuding a completely annihilating aura, grinding his teeth and asking what had happened there. Nuri gathered some information and said it had been a dispute between guilds. And in a great battle that took place some time ago, they destroyed several buildings. They couldn't evacuate the people there in time, and many casualties occurred. Meanwhile, the protagonist was there observing some rubble. He even found a picture of himself. Surely it was his grandmother's doing, trying to find him. And he remembered small memories he had with her in his childhood, always helping her collect cardboard around the neighborhood. They didn't have much money, but at least they were a very happy family. He just stared at the sky because he had truly lived a very happy life with his grandmother in that same house. And Nuri could feel how sad he was. It seemed that the binding ritual made her feel that, but at the same time she could also sense an overflowing rage from him, asking who the bastard was that had done this, where they were because he would destroy them all, Where were the monsters that destroyed this neighborhood, and also his grandmother's house? And he stared intensely back when someone called out to him. It was one of the officers asking for a moment, and that officer could feel that Tai's aura was at least rank or higher, and even bowed in respect. The protagonist only stated that he wasn't feeling very well to talk, and that if the officer valued his life, he should get lost. The officer knew everything that he was there because this situation had happened due to the awakened society, but they didn't know their identities. Our protagonist simply began to walk away without warning, declaring with unrestrained fury that he wanted to find that awakened society. Hey, the officer was completely shocked because that guy was insane, and meanwhile, Serena was calling her team leader. That was because he wanted to stop our protagonist. He ordered everyone to take battle positions. That way they began to conjure several abilities, destroying everything around the protagonist. While one of the guys carrying a huge axe just smiled. Because that guy looked strong, he wondered if he could survive the impact as he leapt toward him. And that giant axe was literally a hair's breadth from the protagonist's neck when he simply grabbed the weapon with his bare hands, and with a small flick, sent the awakened flying. And halfway through, the guy even stopped to take a little nap. After all, it had been a severe blow. The wind mage even stopped midway, completely terrified. And with one hand movement from the protagonist, he destroyed everything around him telekinetically, and ordered everyone to get out of his way while he pressed that boy to the ground. Serena was completely terrified because there was no way to stop that man, and when they looked and saw all their men on the ground, they realized that guy was like an apocalypse itself. So how could they stop a being with such power? At that moment, Nuri grabbed the protagonist's cape, asking her master not to do that, and Taeyang asked who she was to try to stop him from advancing, but he noticed that the girl's face was completely tearful. She couldn't betray him, after all, they were bound by the recording ritual. And Nuri revealed that the awakened society had many good people. He couldn't just go there and annihilate everyone. The society existed to protect humanity from the enemies of the portals. Those people fought day after day to survive. She was also heartbroken upon learning that the protagonist's grandmother had been eliminated in such a ridiculous clash. So once again, she asked her master not to use that power to destroy everyone but to protect them instead. And Taeyang fell completely silent upon hearing all that. And another memory with his grandmother appeared, where she told him that he should help people whenever needed. That memory appeared like a light for the protagonist, showing him the direction he should take. Then he just raised his hands and stroked Nuri's head, thanking her for making him remember good memories. Also thanking her because that was the reason he had returned from that hell. The reason he had fought for so long was precisely because of his grandmother, but also to honor the memories she had left in this world. That was because she had asked him to save the people around him and protect the weak as well. Upon hearing all this, Nuri gave a wide, loving smile. If it weren't for Nuri's soft-hearted pity, he would have simply wiped out everyone in this world. He turned to everyone, declaring that everyone there was under his authority, and that he had one condition to help them from now on. The first condition was to find who had eliminated his grandmother in the middle of that conflict, and they had only 3 days to do it. After all, it's one thing to have mercy for the human race, it's another not to avenge the bastard who killed his dear granny. At the intelligence headquarters, the others were completely shocked and terrified, even worried about the team leader, and in front of them stood Kang, along with Serena and the other protagonists. And they were worried because they hadn't received any news about what had happened on the way. Kang was about to explain the details, but they saw our young man right behind them and asked if by any chance he was also an awakened one, only to explain that he had been a very recent awakened, and there were still no records of him. But the director of that place ordered that guy to be registered immediately, which was strange. After all, a demon lord was going to take a test, and only gave a small smile because that seemed fascinating. That way we go to several people gathered down below. Everyone there had come to become awakened in this world. And the protagonist asked if by any chance he had to wait in that line. And Serena, quite frightened, just said she would try to cut the line for him. She ran to one of the officers, saying she needed a little favor. He ended up checking the spreadsheet, but as she could see, there was a mile-long line, and no one could be allowed to cut ahead, nor could any exceptions be made. And how many girls were trembling with fear? And the protagonist stared at everyone. After all, they were just insignificant beings. He could eliminate them all and go to the front. But Nuri only asked her master not to do that. And Taeyang approached the guy right in front, politely asking him to excuse him. And the guy was completely terrified because everyone there simply fainted on the ground, and the examiner had no choice but to accept that man. After all, he wasn't going to waste time with those insignificant ones in that line, and now should test him. That way, all the people who had fainted were being assisted, and the previous leader came to ask what was causing so much commotion, and he just said that was pure luck. After all, he hadn't eliminated anyone because things could have gotten much worse. And the four-eyed man there was terrified because it seemed like a natural reaction for those who saw the protagonist. Kang even told his boss to get ready because he needed to, since the ranking list would probably change right now with the protagonist entering that room. They informed him that at the center of that room there was a magic orb and that he should place his attacks there, use his most powerful strike, and that way they could calculate his level. And obviously he couldn't do that. If he used his full power, he would completely destroy this place, even the city. So he would use just a little strength, making that orb explode. But nothing happened, and he wondered why he couldn't infuse his mana to do it. and the evaluator on the other side only mentioned that he shouldn't be nervous. It was easy, and Tang just looked at his hands, wondering why it wasn't working, and decided to use a bit more rage and power. And that sphere was completely shattered in the middle of the room, because this time he sent a blast of power through his hands and then ordered everything to explode. That way, a great explosion happened in the center of the room. The evaluator couldn't control the power traces of that orb. Surely that man's power was extremely high and couldn't be measured. And Tang Yan looked at the camera, saying that no toy in that place could measure his abilities. He shouldn't waste time and should give the result as soon as possible. That way the girl took the protagonist's data to her boss, who asked if what was written there was really correct. Meanwhile, the four-eyed director just stared in shock, because upon seeing the protagonist's information, it was clear he had been approved as an S-Class awakened. At the cafeteria, our duo was having some coffee, and he found it wonderful to have a little tea after so long. And Nuri asked if by any chance he liked that tea, and said she could get another one for him, since he was staring at it so much, and indeed he did like it a lot. To the point that he took her tea, and it was so tasty that he felt embarrassed. Nuri then asked what kind of class the protagonist had received, and he only answered that it was the magic class. After all, he couldn't use his real power in there, but his true power also came from magic, and maybe his power was sealed after leaving the demon realm. And Nuri also found it strange that a demon lord had his powers sealed in this world. And since he was a mage, he could pull some parrots out of his hat, some floating balloons and so on. Tu Hyeying was trying to imagine that maybe his demonic castle could be summoned into this world as well. At that moment, they heard someone calling him. The director arrived with the results and informed him that he was S-Class. He was the first S-Class to ever appear in the country, but the protagonist told him to get to the point. It was clear on the four-eyed man's face that he wanted to ask for something, and it was quite perceptive, but Taeying quickly refused. That was because they wanted to announce that he was the first S-Class. That way he would gain many opportunities. And it's not as if Taeying cared about any of that, because if he needed money, he would just get more of it himself. And the promise was that he would cooperate with them as much as he wished. Of course, that was if they could fulfill the conditions he had given earlier. And Kang was irritated because it seemed they couldn't get any more information. That way we're taken to another character laughing that no awakened could stop them now. Then we go to a car speeding at high velocity, and Taeying was right behind it, though they hadn't announced that he was S-Class. They were even preparing a house for him to stay in, and as long as he cooperated with the association, he would get full support from them. The director still couldn't believe that he now had an S-Class by his side. Serena knew that the world's balance of power would be completely distorted now. The director also knew that if they told the world, people would probably feel safer in that country. But for now, they would keep everything quiet and secret. And Taeying went to his new house, which looked like a vacation mansion. While Nuri was completely in love with that place, Taeying preferred his demonic castle. But this place wasn't bad at all. That way, 3 days later, Kang went to that house. He was there to meet with the protagonist, but he felt a pressure coming from the backyard. It seemed to be the sound of a battle taking place. So he quietly entered the place and saw the scene of the protagonists fighting each other. Taeying was trying to increase his disciple's strength, and she was charging forward with those two huge blades in her hands, but none of her strikes could hit the protagonist, who easily dodged everything. But little by little, Nuri managed to move even faster and calculate her speed to attack, even feinting against our protagonist. Yet no matter what she used, the protagonist was simply and ridiculously overpowered. He grabbed the girl's weapons with his bare hands. Then he threw her far away with a severe impact, but even so, she managed to land safely right behind. And Taeying just said they should stop for now, and praised her because she was indeed improving a lot in the last few days. Meanwhile, Kang watched this in disbelief, thinking that girl could become the next monster, but he ended up overhearing their conversation when Nuri asked if, in case they didn't find any culprit for what happened to his grandmother, he would eliminate everyone. The protagonist answered that there would be no mercy if that happened. And Nuri just said that all lives were precious. And again, it wasn't as if that mattered to the protagonist. After all, he had survived in a realm where no one cared if life was precious or not, devouring the flesh of demons. And he answered that it wasn't as if he were an executioner, but rather that he was seeking revenge for his grandmother, and would also leave a warning so that it would never happen again. After all, if he left a striking message, many innocent lives could be spared in the future. And Nuri in a way understood and thanked her master. Kang then opened the door, calling for the protagonist and asking for a moment of his time while carrying a small folder of documents. And the protagonist asked if by any chance those were the same pieces of information as before. And it seemed so, because he looked quite frightened. He also noticed Nuri, who seemed to have a different aura around her, and Taeying just shouted that he had no time to waste. And it seemed that Kang had managed to get some results from the previous investigation. They had linked several people who were members of a guild called Ilsen. They had been a violent gang before becoming awakened, and after gaining powers, they became even worse. They were criminals addicted to violence who tormented ordinary people. Even for the association, it was difficult to stop them because it was a very powerful group. Taeying just raised that book, saying that the association was very lucky now, because they could clean up the trash without dirtying their own hands. He only looked at Nuri, and she didn't say anything either. She knew her master needed this and told them to wait, because now his revenge was closer than he expected. That way we go to the Ilsen Guild. Gil Taihing was the leader of that place and was mocking that their power was too great. But at that same moment, some flames hit the building and caused an explosion right behind the leader, who screamed desperately. What the hell was happening, while several subordinates ran to protect him. Then, rushing outside, they asked who the bastard was that dared to attack the Ilsen headquarters. And everyone was terrified because a kind of black shadow was descending from the skies. Fear began to torment the people of that guild. Then they looked more closely through all that fog and reported that there was something in the middle of all that fire. And when they looked closer up above, there was the protagonist asking if by any chance they were the damned awakened of that guild, and that now they should confess all their sins, and that the body of each one would serve to pay for everything they had done. And his eyes were completely taken by fury and hatred, because he was going to eliminate them all. Everyone there had a face as if they had forgotten to lock the door. Then they left the building, pointed their fingers, and asked who the hell he was. And he did that to distract his target, while one of his henchmen threw a sword toward the protagonist, and that blade was flying at high speed in his direction. Taeyang simply flew toward that blade as well, and completely shattered the ground below, declaring that this was their last chance as he landed. He glared at everyone, saying there would be no more mercy, and the men didn't know who he was or what he wanted. Other men just ran off, apologizing to the rest. But Taeyang asked if running away was even an option while he threw an iron beam in that man's direction, which completely pierced through him and eliminated him. At that moment, Jin Taeyang realized that man was immensely powerful and also completely uncontrollable, since he had an overwhelmingly oppressive aura. His eyes said that no one would leave that place alive, and Gintar was trembling completely because he didn't know what to do. So he ordered his men to take care of that guy while he ran away in fear. Taihing found it very amusing to see the boss of those men simply running like a little rabbit, abandoning his subordinates to be wiped out. After all, the real world wasn't that different from the demonic one. That way, the doors of that guild were shut. Jen Taihing was even closing a steel curtain around the building. Those curtains were made with magic crystals. It was impossible to penetrate and attack there. The guild leader was terrified. Maybe that guy wanted revenge because they had destroyed the neighborhood last time. But another rough-looking guy showed up asking how many people were outside, because inside they had several rank A fighters ready to battle. Then that little group started going out to fight against the protagonist. And everyone was very excited. After all, it was just one man, and they would crush him. And the protagonist just called them weak. After all, attacking in a group like that only showed how pathetic they were. And with just one punch, he managed to clear an entire area of those guys. He flew toward another, grabbed him by the collar, and threw him into the sky. In the same motion, he gave another shove that sent another man flying. And that way, it was like a strike, with several people down behind him. Jinta was hearing his men screaming for help behind that door. And inside the building, the two were completely terrified, wondering what they should do now. But soon the door was completely blown apart. And the protagonist entered, seeing the two little guys on the ground, and joked that he had found the runaway rats. And clearly, the two were terrified. After all the awakened had been knocked out outside. The guy with the messy hair ran to the gate, shouting for them to open it because he was scared and didn't want to stay there. But Taiyang reached him, grabbed his head, and slammed it hard against that iron gate. After all, he was guilty too. Jin Taiyang was trembling in fear because that man was certainly a monster. Taiyang was there to completely destroy that man's guild, and told him to give just one reason not to eliminate him right now. Jin apologized and said that what happened that day, in that neighborhood, had only been self-defense, but it was a lie, because his guild had been the first to attack the people on that street. He had managed to trace all the information, but Jin Taiyang was preparing something behind his back. He was charging his fist with a glove, because if he could get close enough to that guy, he would crush him. Then he lunged forward with that glove and a blade right above it, and he landed a punch directly on the protagonist's face, but was horrified because it felt like he had hit concrete. Taiyang said he would give the guy 1 minute, and told him to give his best shot, and Jin was trembling in fear because even his surprise attack hadn't worked. Then, in sequence, he began striking the protagonist non-stop, who only felt bored. Because that guy was trash, he was bored, since the only reason he had returned to this world was because of his grandmother, and Jin Taiyang just warned that now it was going to hurt a lot. But suddenly his arm went flying, and Jin Taiyang asked why, since a minute hadn't even passed yet, but the protagonist had simply changed his mind. When he looked at him, something shifted in his mind. He said he would give him the full taste of unimaginable pain, while his aura flared behind him. The bloodlust the protagonist was feeling was simply uncontrollable. Then he raised his hands toward Jin Taiyang, who as soon as he entered the other room, saw that all his subordinates had been wiped out. Then he realized he was completely alone, and while his arm was pulled back, he only begged for help. Then screams of pain were heard inside the guild building. Hours later, the police were isolating the place, and the director asked if he had really done all that. After all, it was a huge mess for him to deal with, and the protagonist was walking out from inside. At the association headquarters, everyone was complaining that the guy was a complete murderer. They couldn't let him go unpunished. After all, he had destroyed an entire guild. And the director was completely terrified. After all, there was no way to stop that man. But soon he noticed a man with a glove and a very charming mustache asking about him. asking where he came from. After all, he had destroyed powerful enemies so quickly, like that wicked angel and also the Red Horn. So it seemed it wasn't just luck, that guy was truly powerful, but even so, they couldn't let his actions go unpunished. The director quickly agreed with that, but there was nothing he could do. After all, that man wasn't even human, judging by his power, and his presence completely changed the tone of that room, and the mustached man knew it. After all, face to face with an uncontrollable force, they basically couldn't do anything. Then we go to Nori, who was all cheerful because she was organizing the whole house, but it seemed that everything in that place was exactly the same. All of that had been the director's idea, so she ran toward her master, but she ended up bumping into him just as he was coming out of the shower, got startled, and screamed that he shouldn't come out of the bathroom completely naked, otherwise embarrassing things could happen, but she ended up handing him the protagonist's clothes and then ran away in shame. Then the two went outside into the yard, and Nuri found it strange because her master hadn't said a single word in days, and the mission the director had given her was not to let him do anything reckless, and to meet all of Ty's needs, since he was basically a walking nuclear bomb. Then she had an idea, and asked her master if by any chance he would like to go to the mall, and he found the request strange. And Nuri's idea was to go there to buy some clothes, have some ice cream, and she was delighted the moment he agreed to it, but he soon said that there was one problem before anything else. But she found it strange what he meant by having that problem, and in fact, the problem was that the protagonist didn't have any money at all. And well, it's not like that would be a problem for the association. The protagonist just raised his little hand, stretched out his finger, and from a dimensional rift pulled out a huge magic stone, asking if selling that could earn them some money. That way we go to the city center. Nuri had brought him there because it was a place where they could buy and sell magic stones. There were many association members around that place, and also several awakened ones. Then they quickly went to a counter to negotiate that stone. The woman explained that she first needed to evaluate what he had, but she started sweating cold and asked for a moment, even going to call her manager. And he immediately asked with that bored face what she was doing there, and the evaluator replied that the person outside had brought a stone that was anything but normal. That way the manager told them to come in because he wanted to evaluate it, though he wasn't very confident about it. He probably thought it was just a stone slightly larger than the others. Meanwhile, Nori was super excited and said her master should show the stone. That way the protagonist simply threw his magic stone toward the manager, who began trembling because that stone was the largest he had ever seen. He didn't even know how to price that stone. The woman explained that by its size and magical power, it was difficult to give a price. The protagonist just grabbed that stone again and shattered it into several smaller stones, asking if the manager could now give a price for those smaller stones. And he couldn't believe someone could destroy a magic stone so easily. He only replied that they could buy it, but he would need some time. The protagonist was simply disappointed that the largest market in the country couldn't buy a tiny magic stone he had, and the manager just stared seriously at our protagonist, because they were underestimating him. And Nuri asked if by any chance they would pay right now because they needed cash, and she knew how some things worked around there. They would probably offer a lower price than expected. Then she simply counted on her fingers and asked for 1 billion right now. And the manager gave a crazy look, and it seemed very hard to say no to her, especially with that demonic eye right behind. So he just accepted. He would pay 1 billion for those stones. That way he made the deposit directly into the protagonist's account. Now they could go to the mall to spend money, mainly to buy some new clothes. But the manager was completely destroyed, wondering how those bastards had dared to trick him, the elite. So he decided to call a certain person, and wanted him to take care of some trash that had appeared. While our duo was there in the middle of the mall, and up in the sky a kind of magical formation began to appear. But who cared about that since there were several sales inside the mall? Nuri was super excited to visit the stores, and the protagonist just said that she could buy whatever she wanted because he didn't need anything. But she got upset because the day was special for him, and then pulled him by the arm. After all, they had to buy some clothes for her master, and the protagonist stopped to think because he was a being adored by all in hell, actually feared. And the more he paid attention to that girl, the more peculiar she seemed. Then they went to some department stores, and there a man attended to them, and the girl immediately said they needed some new clothes. That way they started taking measurements of the protagonist, while he looked out the window and saw that catastrophe about to happen. But it wasn't as if he cared about it. After all, it was just a magical explosion happening in the sky. The vendors lined the protagonist up and were completely impressed because it looked like that outfit fit him perfectly. It even looked like a student uniform, by the way. But Nori was truly astonished because he looked so handsome and shouted that the outfit suited him perfectly. And the girl wanted to tell everyone that he was her master, which was strange because just a few chapters ago, she didn't like that idea at all, but somehow they left the store. And Nori asked if by any chance he wouldn't look at himself in the mirror first, but he answered that no, because all he needed was her opinion. And he just gave a totally embarrassed smile, but he told her to hurry because now they had to stop by the stores to buy clothes for her, besides drinking lots of coffee at the restaurant. That way they had a completely delightful afternoon at the mall. But as all good things last little, a great tremor spread throughout the entire mall. It was that same magic portal opening in the sky. Our duo went there to watch and asked if that could be a portal. And the protagonist answered that yes, but it was one he had never seen before. This portal was strange, and a huge arm was coming out of it. It was probably the largest portal ever born in the country, and they had to call the association because it was an unknown portal, and her face was completely terrified. Every time an unknown portal appeared, catastrophe-level enemies would appear and destroy everything, and they were such formidable enemies that an entire nation could be wiped out in hours. The protagonist immediately said that whatever was inside would soon come out, and all the people in the mall went to watch that scene. Tao Haiying even warned that whatever was about to emerge was the most powerful enemy she had ever seen. And suddenly, those hands began to appear even more from the portal. Nuri was trying to call the association to report that an unknown portal was emerging, but she widened her eyes because those hands were coming closer and closer, and the protagonist just told that thing to come out as soon as possible. That way, a gigantic monster ended up emerging and roaring. It stared at everything around it and once again roared so loud and shrill that it destroyed the surrounding buildings and left people almost deaf. Once again, she was screaming at the association and ordering everyone to get out of there because that was a portal opening right in front of the mall. But as always, the cliché of the lonely girl was there. It seemed she had lost her parents, and even though that girl was already quite big, she was crying desperately. And Nuri was completely desperate upon seeing that little girl, but at the same time she needed to report to the association what was happening. Besides, there were hundreds of people inside the mall trying to be evacuated. She went to ask her master for help, but the protagonist was laughing while watching that thing in the skies, and she didn't understand why. The protagonist recognized it. It was a beast of the abyss. They were arrogant, tyrannical, and insane. They transcended their species from birth. He had confronted one while in hell. It was certainly one of the strongest beasts. The protagonist's aura and mana exploded around him. Finally, he would have some fun, but Nuri screamed for her master, and he was startled because he could feel the girl's despair through the binding ritual the two shared. And she was begging him to save the people around. And that little girl kept crying, even with several debris pieces falling toward her. Oh, silly little girl, stop crying. The protagonist just watched that small girl and saw some ants crawling over his feet. That was the same representation humans had for him, and only images passed through his mind showing that this world was very weak. No one could compare to his power. Not humans, not monsters. But upon observing Nuri, he realized he might overdo it and lose her. That was because this world was too fragile to withstand all his power. And if he made one wrong move, many ants could be wiped out. This world was like a sandcastle, and he was a very strong child standing around it. And frankly, all of that irritated him, because in the realm of demons, the rule was strength. Sympathy for the weak or protecting them never existed. But this fragile world completely broke those rules. Living in this world while suppressing all his strength and power was truly uncomfortable. He knew that if he released all his mana now, everyone around him would be obliterated, and no one could stop him. But it was at that exact moment that Nuri had called for the protagonist, and had also asked him to save the people around. Meanwhile, that gigantic dragon was roaring in the skies, and around them several debris pieces were falling. But surprisingly, Nuri drew her swords and managed to shatter everything. Then she leapt toward the falling rubble, and with her two enormous blades, she was able to split all the stones, but right beneath them she couldn't save the two girls, and several massive boulders were about to crush them. However, that great stone was completely disintegrated, turning into dust. Nuri didn't understand, but when she turned she realized it had been her master, radiating an incredible bloodlust. The child's mother opened her eyes, and when she saw all the stones suspended in mid-air, and all of them being redirected once again toward that portal, everyone was frightened, including Nuri. But the protagonist simply stated that his girl should evacuate everyone around, and he was completely controlling the environment, using only his power, apologizing because he had reached a point where he could ignore everyone, including his subordinate. He had reached the level of being an incompetent lord. And she understood that while running to save the people, and only managed a small smile because, indeed, Taiying was changing, and she could only cry because if not for that, everyone there could have been annihilated. That way she began evacuating civilians, creating multiple routes for them to escape the area, and the protagonist once again observed his subordinate. Honestly, he still couldn't understand her, but as he looked toward the sky, he didn't like that there was a monster above his head. Then, from his back, wings began to sprout, and thus black wings with crimson tones emerged. This was the power of the demon lord slowly resurfacing. The protagonist once again spoke to that monster, saying it looked really stupid, and that he would help it return home while grabbing its horn. Then he flew with that monster toward the portal above and smacked the dragon across the face, and no one could believe it. Fighting in the skies would be perfect because that way they wouldn't be interrupted by anyone, and the protagonist's wings kept growing larger and radiating even more power, and a massive mana explosion was forming, and everyone was astonished by it. That way they rose high above the skies. But when I say that, I mean all the way up in the stratosphere. The dragon was searching for its target, and Taiying was speaking in the demon language, saying that no one would interrupt them there. He should give his best in that fight. And at that moment, the two glared at each other, ready for battle. The dragon roared toward the protagonist, and he read the information about that dragon. The creature had lived for almost 8,000 years, and its stats were absurdly high. But the most intriguing thing was that this dragon had a contract with a certain someone, whose identity was not revealed. Besides, this dragon had forsaken itself and ignored the rules of the 7 realms. At that very instant, the dragon roared again, releasing an immense amount of mana, and a gigantic breath was fired toward the protagonist, who in turn had to raise his hands to protect himself from all that magical blast. But the dragon, even after such an attack, was shocked because the being before it was still alive, but the protagonist was somewhat annoyed because he had just bought those clothes, and the dragon was trying to burn them. But it wasn't as if the beast cared and lunged forward. Tai Hang simply stretched his body and also charged with his fists raised toward that monster. He managed to move faster and punched the dragon directly in the neck, and without giving any opening, followed up with another explosive punch. So much so that the dragon even stuck out its tongue in pain, and the two were engaging in a fierce hand-to-hand fight. Tai Hang was feeling great because, after so long, he could finally use his fists. It was an enemy that wouldn't be destroyed with just a touch, and right ahead the dragon's huge mouth was approaching, and almost managed to grab the protagonist. But he dodged and managed to capture the monster once again, raising his fists and landing countless punches. But he ended up realizing that by doing so, several shields rose around that dragon, so once again he tried. He now kicked directly at the dragon's head, but noticed that this was a dragon that could use magic. It was using magic to create shields and block his attacks. And the dragon seemed to be summoning reinforcement from above, which was strange to the protagonist, because in this world, he couldn't control his magic, but there was nothing in existence that couldn't be broken by pure brute force. Then, from a dimensional rift, he pulled out his favorite toy, the blade Ascaloni, the dragon annihilator. And the moment he raised that sword, the dragon felt a surge of fury, and the protagonist asked if by any chance it recognized that sword. It had been forged from the spine of the great dragon lord Zigma. The dragon was enraged upon seeing it. Then once again, it breathed out a massive magical blast. The protagonist simply waited for all that power to reach him. Then, with that blade, he managed to split all that energy, but the dragon didn't stop roaring, and all that power was rushing toward the protagonist, who once again praised it because the creature was truly strong, but it wasn't effective. Then he approached the dragon once more, and with his wings he could fly so fast that the dragon could no longer keep up. Then he positioned himself with that sword, and with a shocking advance, struck directly at the dragon's abdomen. With that sword, his attacks would now be effective, because it destroyed the magic dragons could use, and then he left that sword stuck directly in the dragon's chest, and declared that now it was his turn, landing several extremely fast and powerful punches, sending that dragon flying through space. The dragon was flying at high speed, while on the other side, there was a small crew in a space station that saw that massive monster approaching, and the beast was clinging to the station so it wouldn't fall. With that, it managed to pull itself up onto the station and stand once again. The protagonist kept up and praised the dragon for being quite skilled, wondering what its next trick would be as mana began gathering around it. He sensed that this could be a fire explosion of at least level 6. He was excited to experience all that power once again, but it wasn't as if that would harm our guy, who just patiently waited for the attack, while the dragon roared gigantically. That was because for the protagonist, even if the dragon used magic, it wouldn't be able to harm him since he had maximum level magic resistance, and the dragon realized that its attack had done nothing. And the protagonist asked if it didn't want to fight hand to hand, and just gave a little smirk before charging at the dragon with his fists clenched, and the dragon did the same. On the other side, the association team was evacuating people while Serena was lifting several rocks. That was because the protagonist had forced her to do that kind of training as well. People were being rescued little by little. Even the wounded were already being healed on site, while Jungwoo Kim was observing the whole scene in the skies. And since they didn't see any monsters around, they just announced that everything had been resolved. But they found it strange and asked Nori what had happened, where her master and that enemy had gone. And well, how could she explain that they were up there now, but like way up there? And when someone asked if it meant like in space, there was nothing they could do after all. There was no way to follow those two. But a third person appeared, complaining. How could the enemy simply disappear going into the skies? It was the man scolding Nori, insisting she was definitely lying, but she just stated that it was true, while Jungwoo Kim stepped forward to protect his companion. But the man kept complaining that she must be lying. How could a level 7 enemy appear around here? Kang also appeared, saying that no matter who that man was within the association, he was going too far. But that man even tried to confront Kang, until they felt several tremors, and when they looked at the sky, many trails and flames were falling to the ground, and people panicked because it seemed like the end of the world, while the Awakened shouted for everyone to take cover. But right ahead of those fireballs, great wings appeared. It was the protagonist mitigating the explosions. But even so, they were still falling to the ground and blowing everything up. A gigantic explosion occurred in front of Nuri and the group, and she just watched all of it in shock. But then she broke into a wide smile because the one who had fallen from the heavens was her master, while the others simply couldn't believe it. And I wonder where that department store is located, because look at the guy's clothes, he turned into a fireball, and the outfit is still perfectly fine. Meanwhile, the man couldn't believe what he was seeing now. How had he not seen that gigantic enemy? And who was that newcomer? And the protagonist noticed someone staring fixedly, while Kang just bowed, thanking Tai Hang for all his help and saying he needed to speak with him while summoning a small fairy into his hand. Kang was a summoner, and called for Uriel. That summoning created a space where sound could not escape. Tai Hang realized that the being he had summoned was taking them into a world of fantasy. summoning a being from one of the 7 other realms was truly an incredible ability. But Kang explained that a big problem had just happened because the protagonist managed to destroy that enemy in front of everyone, only proving that he was extremely powerful. There was no way to hide that a level 7 enemy had appeared and was defeated by only one person, and the protagonist already knew that. The protagonist just told the man to hurry up. He didn't want to waste time. He hated wasting time with detours. So, get straight to the point. And Kang stated that they would probably have to reveal his existence to the world. The protagonist remained silent while observing the entire situation around him. That was because, on the other side, several civilians were taking pictures of him. For Taklang, this world still looked like nothing more than a colony of ants, and Kang was terrified because he didn't know if he would be able to convince that monster to help the world. But to Manager Kang's surprise, the protagonist stated that he could do it. He could be revealed to the world. That was strange for Kang. He just didn't want any kind of trouble while he raised his hands and summoned a great surge of power, saying that this should be enough. While Kang and the man watched that with wide, horrified eyes, the protagonist pulled that massive magic stone out from inside the dragon. On the other side of the world, the news was brought to Mr. Anderson, saying that the operation had been cancelled because that level 7 monster that had appeared had been defeated, and they announced the person who had done it. It was a newly awakened being, Tai of ranking S. The man still couldn't believe it. That magic stone was certainly from a very powerful enemy, and when humans were placed in incomprehensible situations, they had only 2 reactions. One was simply to accept everything. The second was to reject it completely, calling the 2 of them scammers, while pointing a finger at them, saying that all of this was ridiculous. No one would believe in something so absurd. Kang told him to shut up and listen, because the association hadn't made the official announcement yet. But the person standing right in front of him was indeed an S-ranked awakened being, but the man still couldn't believe it. How could an S rank appear, and no one know about it? It was probably all some big scam from the association, and the 2 started arguing right in front of Nuri, who shouted that her master wasn't fake. It was because of him that the enemy was destroyed, and all those people were saved. But the man asked why someone with such a low rank was interrupting their conversation, and if by any chance the subordinates of the association had no respect at all. The protagonist just stared at him and said that even if he felt strong, he still looked like a little ant in his eyes. He would ignore everything that man was saying at that moment. But when he looked at Nuri, he stated that if anyone dared to be rude to her, he would eliminate them on the spot. And the protagonist's gaze clearly thirsted for blood, and he left a very clear warning. He should never again speak ill of his subordinate, or of him, or he would go after the man. And the man realized that fear was consuming him, and that guy knew he was dealing with a completely bloodthirsty beast. Our protagonist didn't need to say anything else. His aura alone was enough, and the man just collapsed to the ground completely powerless. And the protagonist just called for Nuri, who only said goodbye to Kang while following her master. And I myself was there watching the man completely in tears. Honestly, it was hard to believe that Tai Hying had managed to leave a B-ranked man completely powerless with just a look. That way we go to the protagonist's house, and the association's press conference was announcing that an S rank had been born in the country, and it seemed that now the entire world already knew of his existence. They also explained that there were only 9 S-ranked awakens around the world, and from now on, in this country, or rather across the entire world, there would be no organization daring to challenge him. And the strangest thing was that there was no response from other countries. Normally, when a high-ranking being appeared, all the major nations of the world tried to make contact. But with the appearance of Tai, the balance of global power would certainly change. And that was exactly what Nuri had been expecting from her master. But Kang knew the other countries wouldn't stay quiet. Soon, they would try to make contact. And Kang explained that some countries were already interested in visiting the protagonist, but he refused. He had no interest at all in making friends with other countries, and grew irritated as he crushed a can in his hand, because he was being compared to the other 9 S ranks, and certainly all of them were weaker than him, but he asked them not to worry because he wouldn't do anything stupid. And the girl was thinking about how she could convince her master. After all, making allies around the world would be something very positive, but she ended up coming up with a brilliant idea, because he had been excited to face such a powerful enemy that day. Then she raised her hand, asking Kang if that Mr. Anderson was currently the strongest man in the world on the hunters list. And that sparked the protagonist's curiosity, and Kang said yes. Among the team that wanted to visit Tai, he was the most powerful in the world. Mr. Anderson was known as the military chief of the United States, and he specifically wanted to meet Tai. And of course, our guy found that interesting, and simply said that he had changed his mind. He wanted to meet those people. He would meet the strongest man in this world. That way we move forward to a few days later on a private jet, and around them several people were taking photos because this was the team arriving from the United States. And right behind was Mr. Anderson, with an extremely calm expression, telling his men not to do anything stupid because they were there only for a visit. But one of the men said that the Pentagon had left certain instructions for them, and in a way they were prepared to meet the new S rank. And so we are introduced to 3 members of the Wolf Squadron from the United States. And when they went to the office, one of them ordered the others to pay attention to the missions they had. The first was to recruit the new S-ranked awakened, and the other was also to test his strength and limits. That mission would be under Anderson's command, but he himself stated that if this new awakened refused, he could crush him like an insect. And the protagonist felt anger at that moment, though he didn't understand why, and continued sipping his coffee. He was starting to feel bored, so he picked up his phone to check some new headlines and saw an article about Mr. Anderson. He seemed to be one of the greatest fighters in this world, and Nuri arrived soon after, saying that the wolf team had finally arrived in the country, and the protagonist just gave a faint smile because it seemed his boredom would finally end, and Mr. Anderson was a celebrity to Nuri. She looked up to him. The protagonist tried to imagine if those men were strong because of body modifications, since in the demon world such modifications existed. That's why he was no longer considered 100% pure human. He had faced many powerful beings in hell but had never seen a pure human there, and Nuri said they were right behind that door. And the protagonist was curious to know how strong they were, and when the door opened they turned. That was because the protagonist somehow drew attention, even without emitting any mana or aura around him. But at the same time he and Anderson stared at each other with a wicked grin. The director was introducing all the teams there, but it was his first time meeting the protagonist, and he extended his hand. His name was Jian, the director of national intelligence, but the protagonist didn't even turn to greet him, continuing to stare at Anderson, so he just apologized to the director for that. But the man soon noticed that Tai Hying was far more interested in someone else. Then he pointed to the 3 soldiers who had come from the United States. The first to introduce himself was Jensen, the representative of the delegation, and Nuri was shocked because that man was speaking the same language as them, but she also found it strange that her master wouldn't stop staring at Jensen. That was because our guy was using those analysis screens again, examining the one standing right behind Jensen. That was because Mr. Anderson truly was strong, as strong or even stronger than the dragon he had defeated days ago. But the third soldier, the crazy one, suddenly stepped forward, pushing Jensen aside and grabbing the protagonist's hand to shake it, saying that people in this country were supposed to be polite, and that showing courtesy by shaking hands was the least one could do. And Nuri's eyes widened. That lunatic wanted to test the protagonist by using his strength now, hoping to crush him before Anderson even entered the fight. But at that moment Nuri only lowered her head, and the man started screaming in pain while his comrades watched. That was because his hand was being completely crushed by the protagonist's strength. The man even began to conjure a magical explosion in his hand, while Nuri threw herself in front of the director to protect him, and the leader of the delegation was yelling at Brad. However, the protagonist simply made that power vanish, and indeed, all the flames in the man's hand disappeared completely, and he was left speechless, seeing his power fade away. But right then, the protagonist's fist was approaching, and with one punch, the entire air around them exploded toward Brad. They could even feel that pressure shielding the director, but Tai Hying was impressed because Brad had been protected. Anderson stepped forward with his Excalibur, asking him to stop for a moment. He also apologized for his comrade, who seemed like a wild beast. He asked if the protagonist could let it go. He simply replied, yes, while Brad was there holding his aching hand. Anderson sheathed his sword and told Jensen to get that idiot out of there. And Nuri felt really worried about it, saying she would take them to a healer in the building. That way everyone left the room, and Anderson said he would teach his comrade a lesson as soon as they returned, while putting his sword back in the arsenal. The protagonist just said that guy was too weak and that they should stop pretending because they were already there. Anderson found that amusing, because calling a rank weak really took a lot of arrogance. But the fist he had used to block with his sword earlier was still trembling. That guy had the strength to justify his arrogance. He knew that if they ever became enemies, that man would be a major headache. Then he asked if by any chance he wasn't interested in joining the United States, but the protagonist quickly refused. Which was strange to Anderson because he hadn't even started explaining the benefits, and he noticed Tai Hying's hands trembling with anger. At that moment he was releasing his aura. That was because he wanted to know how strong Anderson really was. After all, that was one of the reasons they came. And well, the blonde man just gave a smirk because that was exactly why he was there too. On the other side of the building, the healer was regenerating Brad's hand. He was very nervous looking at his crushed hand, but Jensen said he had chosen that path himself, and Brad only did it because that man was disrespecting them. But they asked if Jensen had something wrong with his head. After all, he was being extremely arrogant. Tai Hying was an S rank, one of the strongest of humanity. Whoever holds such a title has every right to be arrogant. And he shouldn't forget that the wolf team was powerful only because of Anderson. He should remember that he was only on the team because of his skill to support the others with his abilities. And Brad was getting angrier and angrier because he was being completely underestimated. He stood up shouting that he had never recognized that man as an S rank. How could someone like that be born with so much power in such an inferior country? And if they got another S rank on the wolf team, they would surely become the greatest force in the world. But Nari just said that the man had been very lucky. That was because if her master had wished it, he would have been instantly eliminated in that room, and that was quite a heavy statement, so much so that the man burst into laughter upon hearing that little girl say it. Then he just approached, asking if she happened to know who he was. But she replied that she didn't know him, though she knew her master very well. He was certainly the most powerful being in all of humanity. and once again Brad began laughing together with Jensen as well. After all, she was being completely deluded by the fantastical tales of that little country, but very soon, they would probably find out who was truly the strongest. That was because as we move up the floors, the protagonist and Anderson were standing face to face, and the blonde man drew his sword Excalibur and pointed it at the protagonist, calling him to a duel. On the other side, the director was watching everything, wondering if this was some kind of power test assigned by America. After all, these two must be the strongest among the S ranks, and he hoped that at least the building structure could withstand their powers. And Anderson looked rather bored, asking if Tai Hing happened to have any weapon to use. And the protagonist replied that he didn't need a weapon to fight someone of such a low level. But even so, considering the man had incredible swordsmanship skills, he decided to open his inventory to pull out a weapon. The problem was, in his space he only had weapons of level 8 or higher. So he started searching through all that space he had, and then showed a slight grin. This was the item he had obtained when he reached the pinnacle of the demon realm. It was called the Seal of Infernal Loyalty, and Anderson could feel a pressure emanating from that inventory portal. While Tai Hing just laughed because it had been a long time since he had used it, he pulled out his beloved Stormblade, and only asked whether it was better than Anderson's precious Excalibur. Strange, because Tai Hing seemed to be a bare-handed fighter, but now he was drawing a weapon with impeccable mastery. And the protagonist just replied that he was a mage, but Anderson didn't need to worry about that. After all, to challenge a swordsman, one must have a sword too. Anderson simply called him quite arrogant as he positioned himself for battle. Then he leapt toward the protagonist, and our guy widened his eyes as he watched the man advance with such speed, and on the first impact, he dodged. Half of the arena flew apart, and that seemed to be only the power of the sword, and the director was shocked because that strike was immensely powerful. It had shaken the building's entire structure. With his current power, Anderson could defeat level 7 enemies with just one of those attacks. And the director quickly imagined that they would have to rebuild the entire building after the fight. Meanwhile, the protagonist gave another grin, saying that the man had done very well with that strike, and his opponent widened his eyes because that guy managed to dodge and was still laughing. He wanted to wipe that damned grin off his face as soon as possible. Then the two began exchanging several sword strikes, while Tai Hing praised the man a lot but wanted to increase the difficulty. So he leapt, and Anderson realized that was dangerous, and Tai Hing passed with flawless precision, striking his weapon directly against Anderson, who went flying and crashed into the ground. And he felt a heavy impact from that fall, and the protagonist only hoped mentally that the man, being the strongest in this world, wouldn't lose with just that move. And the guy ended up remembering a time when he had faced the Bone Collector, a level 5 enemy. It was after defeating that foe and taking its spine that he had been classified as an S rank, and he also used that spine to forge his precious Excalibur. It was his indestructible sword that had crossed countless seas of blood. Then he simply stretched his hand toward the sword and managed to grab it, pushing himself up once again. And Tai Hing praised him once more while Anderson was acknowledging the protagonist's strength. But now he would fight to truly eliminate him, and the protagonist liked that very much. He wanted a fight like this, he wanted to have fun. And while the director was pulling his hair saying they couldn't do this, the blonde man changed the way he held his sword, shifting into execution mode, and Tai Hing praised him because now he could feel genuine killing intent through the vibrations. Even Anderson's blade was trembling with the intention to strike the protagonist, and he dashed forward at a sinister speed through the hall, his sword nearly grazing the protagonist's head. And that was exactly what our guy needed. He wanted more skills like that, and the director was just watching, realizing that this no longer looked like a simple duel. It could even become an international incident, but another director, along with Serena, arrived. They both concluded that no one could stop that fight except another S rank. Thus, they would have to wait for the duel's outcome. Meanwhile, Serena merely mentioned that she believed Tai Hing would be fine. That was because he seemed to be holding back and maybe wouldn't destroy the entire building. But in the next moment, several pillars began to tremble, and she took that back. Maybe he would destroy the building. Yes, and Jane remained worried, but considering recent events, it seemed the protagonist was on their side. And for Serena, her only concern was with Anderson, because now he seemed to be struggling in that fight, accelerating through several points to try to strike the protagonist. But it seemed our guy hadn't even moved from his spot, just standing there counterattacking, while the building began collapsing. And Tai Hing realized that even though he wanted that man to show all his power, and Anderson was frustrated because he was supposed to be the strongest person in this world, there was no one above him. And certainly Tai Hing wasn't an exception as he charged forward with his sword. And when he got close, Tai Hing praised him once more because the man was getting deeper into the rhythm of battle. And Anderson only gasped with wide eyes because the protagonist appeared beside him, emanating a completely annihilating aura, declaring that the entire building was about to disappear. Anderson tried to react with his sword. He simply grabbed that blade and stated that they would not fight there anymore. Anderson managed to pull the sword free but realized that Tai Hing had disappeared right before his eyes. That was because he was now standing right behind him. He felt a great danger approaching. That guy was really not joking around. Then he narrowly dodged an attack that almost struck his head, and when he looked at the ground he saw an extremely deep cut, and it seemed as if his entire world was trembling now. That was fear. The terrible fear was consuming him. Soon, he, the strongest person in this world, felt fear. Then he simply turned that fear off and rushed toward the protagonist, using another series of battle sword techniques. But it seemed that all his attacks were entering some kind of black hole, not understanding what was happening, yet feeling his entire arm being sucked into that void. That was nothing more than the natural power our protagonist possessed, who then said that arrogance was a privilege only for the strong. Anderson was nothing but a weak and arrogant human who proclaimed himself the strongest in this world. If he couldn't even protect himself, how could he protect the entire world? Then he simply slapped his head, sending him flying to the ground and destroying everything. Jen was completely terrified, while the other director also widened his eyes, because for the protagonist, that slap was revenge for those damned eyes they all had. And outside, the entire structure of the building was shaking. Inside, Brad noticed that they had finally started the fight and told the little girl to forget that master of hers, who was probably already losing. After all, Anderson was going to kick his ass, but Nuri at that moment became so angry that her own aura began to radiate, and the two boys were surprised, even scared. Jensen considered that this girl would be at most a rank B, but the power she was emitting now was far higher, and Nuri called Brad out for a fight. After all, he was mocking her master. That was one of the pieces of advice Tadye had given her, that she should never let others look down on her. Regardless of the opponent she faced, she must always make the first move, and above all, always keep her pride. And Brad noticed that the girl was drawing her swords and asked Jensen what he should do, and he just replied that Brad should stop making such a mess. Meanwhile, Nuri was advancing toward the man. She was channeling some sort of electricity into her blades, but widened her eyes as she was overtaken by the mana surrounding her. It was Jensen doing that, freezing the entire area, and he apologized for his comrade. He was being very rude, so he asked her to stop, but Nuri was furious because she was the one being told to stop when he was the one who started it. So once again she stood up, pointing her sword at Brad because he needed to be punished. And the man, upon hearing that declaration, became completely enraged and prepared to fight the girl. Then he was going to teach her a lesson, with a magic portal appearing right behind him. That way several freezing projectiles were launched toward the girl, and from the upper floor tremors could already be heard. Taehyung already suspected what that was. Then he simply threw Anderson to the ground, telling them to take care of his injuries. He hadn't killed him. The directors were quite relieved that he hadn't caused a global incident with that, and Jian, in a way, was in disbelief that this new guy had managed to defeat the highest-ranking fighter in the world. Most likely, Taehyung was now the most powerful person in the entire world, and maybe now they could surpass the strongest countries in the global power ranking. But Taehyung quickly shattered that idea, telling them not to have any kind of ulterior interest, because he had fought only to see how strong the most powerful person in this world was. He didn't care at all about the country's problems, and Jian sensed firmness in those words, and the protagonist simply walked away, ordering them not to bother him anymore. And outside, he looked up and saw that the air was freezing cold. He even approached several icicles that had formed. That was because on the upper floors, Nuri was still fighting against that damned man who was praising her, saying she was really good. And to Jensen, his comrade's reputation was definitely falling. After all, he was an A rank, losing to a mere ordinary girl. Brad conjured more ice spears to fly toward the girl, but he had an ace up his sleeve as he extended his hands. It was freeze magic, and several ice formations appeared around her as Nuri began to panic because countless ice crystals started forming around her body. She was completely freezing over, and he stepped closer, mocking her. After all, who was going to punish whom now? And Nuri was saddened, apologizing to her master because she hadn't managed to punish the one who insulted him. Honestly, she couldn't win against that man right now. Jensen ordered his comrade to stop, but surprisingly, they saw a glove piercing through the walls. That hand was heading straight toward Brad, until it grabbed his head and lifted him off the ground. It was our protagonist. Nuri only asked how in a weak, exhausted voice, and the moment the protagonist laid eyes on her, he was completely enraged that his subordinate was so injured. Jensen tried to protect his friend, but even while releasing so much power in that room, the protagonist wouldn't let go. Then, with just a single motion, he slammed the man's head directly into the ground, completely destroying everything below it. The protagonist was now feeling a blazing fury. The protagonist had dragged Brad's body for a long distance, causing an explosion of flames around him, and only left the man on the ground, asking how he dared to touch something that was his. Who the hell did he think he was in this world? And Jensen was completely terrified and afraid. The protagonist also turned toward him. After all, he had hurt something precious to him, so he was going to devour him now. But Nuri placed her hand in front, saying that she was fine. There was no need to hurt everyone there, and her gaze was truly sincere. When the protagonist looked at her, he simply turned his face away while helping her, as the girl was collapsing without strength. She couldn't even speak, having spent so much energy. But Taehyung said that everything was fine because now he was there to protect her. Then, from the palm of his hands, he began to conjure a kind of healing power, and all the exhaustion the girl had been feeling suddenly disappeared. At that moment, the information arrived for Jensen that Mr. Anderson had lost the battle. The protagonist ordered them to leave the country before he changed his mind and sent everyone to hell. And from that day on, the title of the strongest in the world changed hands. It was reported that the wolf team had simply decided to return to their home country without giving any explanation. A certain man was watching and found it all very strange, but if they had done that, then that newcomer must have been truly incredible. So he just looked up and sighed. This was the leader of the Zay Guild, and right in front of him was a girl saying that they had to meet that guy first. Serena appeared, saying she was worried. She believed they had disappeared after that incident, but in truth, our protagonists had returned home. They simply didn't tell anyone, they just came back. And the problem for Serena was that outside there were crowds of paparazzi wanting more information. After all, Tai Hying's figure had become public, and he was now famous. The protagonist just looked at her, saying that he didn't want to be bothered, and the girl apologized profusely but said that because of all this, they would give him a brand new house, fully furnished and enormous. The protagonist honestly didn't want it, but when he looked to the side, he could see that Nuri was completely enchanted by the idea. After all, they were offering them an incredible house, though she apologized, saying she knew she didn't have the right to give an opinion. And Serena was frustrated because it seemed she had just offended him, but was surprised when he accepted. So they could move to this new house now? Thus we go to an isolated island near the continent, and it seemed that this would be the place where the protagonist would live. Nuri was completely in love with the idea of living on a paradise island. The association had bought this island especially for Tai. They would have everything provided by the association, and there was no need to worry. Even the protagonist liked the place, saying that it wasn't bad at all, and Serena went absolutely crazy. How could he say not bad? This place was simply incredible. But there was still something she needed to deliver to them. It was a letter sent by the Cooperating Association along with the United States. They were apologizing for what had happened with the wolf team earlier, and they were also going to begin cooperating with his country to promote further development in the future. Of course, one of the requirements was that Tai would help the United States whenever a calamity occurred. All the details would be inside those papers, but Taeyang would be the one to decide in the end whether he would help or not, and only in cases where Mr. Anderson could not fight against an opponent. In this case, the protagonist was quite pleased, because it would be a real threat, so he decided to accept all that cooperation. Serena didn't quite understand, but she thanked him anyway. She even asked if by any chance Taeyang wanted to lead a team of awakened ones to face the monsters from now on. They would provide all possible support, and of course focus on tougher battles. The protagonist knew this was just a way to make him work more, and Serena was trying every way to convince him. They wanted to form that team also because Nuri was growing in strength and form. The protagonist agreed, but said he would be the one to choose the members of that group. Serena fully agreed with that. He would be the leader, and could choose freely, and Nuri only apologized along the way, because all of this felt like a dream. She had always wished to live in a house on an island, but didn't know how to get to the other side. But her master said that it wasn't necessary for her to know. Then he grabbed her directly into his arms. Serena just saw that lunatic flying through the skies. With a single leap, he had crossed the entire region, and the girl was completely speechless, as they were soaring above the island, her eyes glowing while the protagonist had unfolded his wings. At the house, there was a manager, and several butlers, and they looked up. That was because the protagonist landed at that exact moment, and everyone was completely paralyzed by his presence as they looked at their new employers. While the manager congratulated them for arriving at their new home, Taeyang asked if they had arrived early, but that wasn't the case. They had arrived at the exact time. Shang introduced himself. He was the head butler, and would be responsible for managing the household. And Tai, at first glance, liked the man. Shang asked them to follow him, as he wanted to show them the house. And Nuri was completely enamored with the place. The protagonist called it decent, and that irritated the manager, because the place was quite sophisticated. So he decided to show the kitchen, where renowned chefs worked, and Nuri was enjoying all the food available. There was even a bartender to prepare fresh drinks, a music room, and even an improvised pool. And Shang asked if by any chance, his master was now satisfied. And once again the protagonist replied that he liked it. It really wasn't bad at all, as he watched Nuri having so much fun, because it seemed that now the real enjoyment was about to begin. Then a few days later, a helicopter landed on the island, and our protagonists were waiting. It was Leader Kang arriving, thanking Taeyang for the offer he had given him, and also introducing the members he had requested, including a new A-ranked awakened one, Lee Yujin. And she immediately fixed her gaze on our protagonist. Could he be the man from the rumors, the S-rank? But honestly, she was bored because this guy didn't make any kind of impression. And who was that child beside him? Kang told her to have a bit more sense, and that she should greet the owners of the house. But she just stared at that little girl, telling her to go back home to her mommy's arms. Of course, the blonde was completely offended at being called a little girl, and Lee Yujin was completely displeased because she had been invited to meet the S-rank, but he looked like a worthless man. She just asked to get out of that place while the protagonist finished his coffee. Meanwhile, Kang lowered his head, apologizing. That girl was a novice, she didn't know the rules, and the protagonist approached her, saying that she was very arrogant, but with that came the need for power. But as someone who also had power, she needed to recognize her opponents. As he began to raise all his mana, that she was just an ignorant ant, who didn't know when she'd be crushed. And Lee Yujin began to feel completely dizzy. She had never felt so bad before. While Nuri merely closed her eyes, the protagonist began lowering all his power. He wasn't going to take this any further. And Lee Yujin was filled with a completely vile sensation. It felt as if her entire body had been crushed. But anyway, the protagonist actually liked her, so he told her to continue as well. After all, he wanted to see what she was capable of doing against his subordinate. People treated Nuri like a child because of her small body, and at that moment, she drew her 2 grand blades, and Lee Yujin was already bored at the thought of having to fight a kid. The protagonist ordered the two to fight with full strength. Only then could he evaluate them. And Lee Yujin, knowing that, decided to use all the power she had in that battle as well. Lee Yujin used the power of copying, loading, and transformation. And Taeyang smiled upon seeing that because the girl's abilities were related to shapeshifting. Nuri was quite surprised at what she was watching because her opponent was transforming. Even Kang had never seen that ability before, and out of all that mist, Lee Yujin appeared. Wow, what an ugly and horrible thing, my god, who designed that form? But the protagonist liked that ability. When he had looked at her stats before, he noticed nothing special, but she had the ability to change shape. In the demon world, many had that ability, and could grow stronger by taking on the forms of others. And she was in a way exceeding the protagonist's expectations because she had managed to take the form of a high-level monster, and Nuri began to sweat under that pressure, because those red horns could belong to that level 6 monster that had appeared some time ago. And Taeyang pointed out that this seemed to be the blonde's nemesis and questioned what she was going to do now. Even Lee Yujin said that if she was scared, she could run away. After all, that was what happened to weaker opponents. But Nuri just steadied her sword, saying that she was very happy. After all, she could have her revenge now. Revenge for the day she was weak and let that monster kill many people. And she simply gave a small smile, ready for battle. In this way, the blonde dashed forward at maximum speed, and booms were heard all over the island. The workers were wondering what was happening. They even asked the manager if the place was going to explode out of nowhere. Shang replied that the location was built to withstand very powerful attacks, and outside the 2 girls were exchanging blows. He was impressed that this girl could have such speed and strength in such a small body, but even so she could end it while channeling a fireball in her hands and throwing that entire power toward the girl. However, Nuri had vanished from sight and reappeared right behind her. But Lee Yujin managed to dodge. It looked like a scene straight out of the Matrix. Next, Nuri's hair flew through the air. That was because Lee Yujin had landed a kick on the girl's head, but Nuri managed to defend herself with her massive blade. Even so, she was sent flying by the force of the impact. Even flying so far away, she still kept her guard up, and Lee Yujin didn't let up, rushing toward her and landing multiple hits. And she was getting impatient to the point of creating another fireball. But this time she imbued it into her claws, launching it upward, and the poor girl was already in midair. While Lee Yujin praised her, saying she was better than expected, then she hurled another wave of magic in her direction. Kang realized that it was the same type of power as that of the previous enemy, and that whole blast was getting dangerously close to Nuri. And then moments later, it exploded completely. Kang was completely terrified, but the protagonist just smiled, and Lee Yujin was clearly exhausted but still confident in her victory. After all, it was impossible to lose. She was an A rank awakened but couldn't see that girl through the smoke. That was because Nuri had managed to dissipate that magic. She was right above, landing a kick directly on Lee Yujin's head, and while she stood over her, she drew her massive sword and held it against Lee Yujin's neck, and one could see that Nuri's eyes were now completely locked onto her opponent. And Lee Yujin felt a certain shiver while the protagonist shook his head but then shouted, asking if it was ready. Then Nuri stopped pressing the sword that was at Lee Yujin's neck. Taeyang really liked what he had just seen and told Nuri to get off the dragon. And Lee Yujin couldn't understand how she had lost because her strength, speed, everything was far superior. While watching that little pair, she realized she had lost because she had no real battle experience, and with that man by her side, she knew that she would definitely become more powerful. But the protagonist immediately refused her. The only interesting thing about her was her abilities, but she seemed like a newborn baby. He didn't wish to train her under his wing, but she was still a good opponent, and if she wanted, he could give her another chance. Though he turned to Kang, asking if he had received any news. And Kang didn't quite understand, but his phone started vibrating, and soon they said they had a big problem because a sea of fire had swallowed Japan. That way the Allied forces were heading there to help. Nuri asked if it wouldn't be faster for her master to fly, and he asked if when she went out she preferred to run instead of taking a car. And for Lee Yujin, those two seemed quite idiotic, having such a casual conversation before a major battle. Kang arrived to explain the whole situation. A few hours earlier, they had received information about a large unknown portal that had opened above Japan. They had also requested help from several countries, and things there were getting really bad. They had also lost all contact with the awakened ones over there. And for now, the only thing they knew was that the monster that came out of that portal had been classified as level 8. Nuri asked if by chance Lee Yujin was okay, seeing her completely frightened face. She asked them why they weren't nervous, It was a level 8 enemy and Nuri was actually nervous, but they were going there to save people, and anyway she didn't need to worry. After all, they had their master by their side. He was imagining that this level 8 was stronger than that dragon he had fought, and he really hoped it would be strong enough to entertain him. And there in Japan, a giant spider was leaping over the buildings as the plane entered the airspace. At that moment, the protagonist wanted to jump straight into the operation zone, saying that he would go alone and first, so he simply projected his wings while falling from that plane. Nuri also said she would jump and even helped Lee Yujin fasten her parachute to jump as well. And when it was secure, she told her to relax and not be nervous, that things down there would be fun. She believed that Lee Yujin would be fine. After all, she had proven to be very strong in their duel, and the girl was quite surprised to receive that compliment out of nowhere. So she just thanked him, but of course he had to throw in a jab. After all, he was stronger than her. Thus they would jump together to save the people of that place. Lee Yujin just closed her eyes to jump, but Nuri gave her a little push. After all, she was trembling with fear and was already crying in midair, screaming loudly. It seemed that she was afraid of heights. On the other side, the protagonist was already arriving in the action zone when he noticed several movements below. A gigantic arachnid was waiting. And then, in midair, he pulled from his inventory his beloved thunder sword. And in a way no one expected, he threw that sword in the direction of the monster. That was because down below, Koharu, an A-class from Japan, was trembling with fear in front of the enemy. It was that gigantic spider, ready to devour her. So she just closed her eyes, already expecting to be killed. And it was at that moment that the spider noticed a great formation of mana right above, and suddenly a huge explosion happened over it. And Koharu stood there, mouth open, not understanding where that enemy had gone, because in front of her a sea of smoke and power was forming. On the other side, the girls were almost arriving. Nuri, without wasting time, had already drawn her grand swords, heading to protect Koharu in the process. After all, that explosion was about to hit the girl as well. And when everything finally passed, Nuri turned and asked if the girl behind her was okay as she saw the two heroines standing there. Up ahead, that spider was still alive. And Taeying found that quite amusing, because that spider was truly an anomaly, and also ugly as hell. Honestly, he had never seen anything like it. That was because the stats of that spider were also insane. It had the same characteristics as that level 7 dragon he had fought weeks earlier. And in addition, it had a unique specialty called divinity. The protagonist laughed because that monster was an exiled god. That was quite interesting, because he himself was also a god exiled from hell. So he rushed into battle, eager to test the spider's strength, and maybe this would be fun. Then, with his sword, he dealt several strikes against the spider, and wore a big smile because the enemy could withstand his blows. The spider began roaring loudly after being attacked, and a great clash of abilities ended up slicing half the city apart. Koharu was completely astonished by this, and while Nuri had to drag her away because the explosion was almost hitting them, both couldn't take their eyes off their master fighting. Meanwhile, Koharu was asking what the hell all that was, who was that man she could barely even see attacking the monster so fast. And Nuri explained that that was Tai, or rather, her master, and that he was an ally. She didn't need to worry. After all, he was the coolest person in the world, and from now on, she didn't need to worry about that ugly spider anymore. But Koharu slapped Nuri's hand away, saying that she was just a mere C rank and shouldn't bother her, that she didn't need help from a brat like her. And Nuri questioned what kind of manners those were, talking like that to someone who had just saved her. And Nuri certainly already had the level of an A rank. And Koharu got nervous when questioned, but Nuri simply told her to shut up. After all, she was being completely disrespectful, and they should just watch what was happening up ahead. That was because the spider had begun to tremble. It was only because this was another spider, a smaller one than the gigantic one the protagonist was fighting. It was one of the offspring of that great catastrophic deity, and the girls positioned themselves to battle against this monster. Nuri told them to stay alert. After all, that monster also seemed to be very powerful. Thus the two went head to head in battle as well. Meanwhile, on the other side, the protagonist was exchanging blows with that giant spider, and in one of his advances, the spider opened its enormous mouth, throwing an entire web ahead of him, and as he charged toward it, he ended up being captured. Using those webs, the spider hurled the protagonist into another nearby building, destroying everything. Hey, our big guy didn't like that at all. He was frustrated because his sword wasn't causing any damage to that monster. He decided to raise his level just a little bit. The spider was shocked to see the power growing within the protagonist. After all, he had to deal with that bastard monster. He would show it what it desired most, because for the first time in this world, he summoned his true form. At that moment, the spider let out a scream of despair. While the protagonist stood there wearing only a tight pair of shorts, Taeying suddenly vanished from sight, and even the girls far away could sense that presence. The giant spider was afraid now, because the protagonist had grabbed one of its fangs, and was challenging it to fight him in his demonic form, and survive. but the spider did what anyone would do. It jumped far away in fear, but the protagonist wasn't going to let it escape. He conjured his demonic wings and took flight in pursuit. And in midair, he landed a massive punch on it, sending the spider crashing back to the ground, after which it spat out webs infused with mana. But Tahin was faster and managed to dodge, and with a new thunderous strike, the entire city floor shook. He was thrilled to see how resistant this spider was against his fists and began pounding the creature non-stop, until he got very close to its eyes, praising it for having impeccable endurance, but its eyes were probably very sensitive. Then, with a devastating attack, he destroyed one of the spider's eyes, which once again screamed in pain as the protagonist flew upward. That scream was so shrill that the girls on the other side were becoming disoriented. Even Tahin felt dizzy upon hearing all that noise, so he decided to land another blow on the spider to make it shut up. He quickly returned to the ground, joking that every enemy had a weakness. The protagonist then decided to tear out one of the spider's fangs and use that same sharp fang to pierce directly into the spider, and it worked, causing massive damage to the creature. While Tahin smiled, but at that moment the spider began releasing a venom. It seemed she had reached her final form, completely enraged and rising up. The protagonist noticed all that poison, and staying in that place would be very bad. He could feel the venom entering even his fortified body. It definitely wasn't an ordinary poison, it was a world annihilation toxin. Nearby, Nuri was fighting against that smaller spider, and they kept battling with all their strength while Kaharu thought it was impossible to defeat those enemies, until she received a message saying she needed to leave the area because a processing team was being sent. And Nuri, while fighting, received a message from her master stating that his subordinates should get out of there as soon as possible, so she also warned Lee Yujin. That was because all those spiders around them were releasing that annihilation venom and it was spreading over a huge area. Lee Yujin understood why they had to leave now. Nuri explained that it was an order from her master and that they needed to get out, while Kaharu kept asking what was happening, but they just grabbed her and took off running. If she wanted to live, she needed to stay with them right now. The protagonist realized that his subordinates had left the area and now he had to deal with the poison and the spiders, so he placed his hand into his spatial inventory once again and pulled out a kind of fire that covered his arm. After all, poison could be countered now with dragon fire, and that same flame began spreading across his body, forming a massive pillar, and the spider became completely agitated. Tahin noticed that the spider felt deeply threatened by that little flame, so holding it he charged forward once again and created a massive trail of fiery destruction, and the spider in turn was channeling a kind of magic between its pincers. It was ready to counterattack that immense power coming toward it. Thus it conjured that deadly lightning beam, while the protagonist was also rushing toward it with the entire ground shaking around him, but it seemed he got the worst of it, being struck by those bolts. He even spat blood because the pain was immense. Even Nuri felt that pain coming from her master due to the bond they shared. Meanwhile, the protagonist was impaled with several venomous spikes, each one injecting poison into his body. It was definitely a divine level poison. The girls stopped to watch what was happening, but for the spider the worst possible enemy was the protagonist, because poisons were meaningless to his body even as more of them formed inside him. That was because while in hell he had absorbed the blood of a hydra, and now all poisons were insignificant within his body. And the spider realized that the man hadn't fallen from her attack, and the horns on the protagonist's head were growing even larger, with lightning shooting from his eyes. Rage was consuming him even more. He wanted to end this fight. Then with a new advance he struck a heavy blow on the giant spider. Hey, Lee Yujin could only gape at so many strange things happening. Our big guy was right above that arachnid, saying that now it was the end. Then he began to channel even more mana from his body, causing several impacts and strikes right above the beast. Kaharu stood there, mouth wide open. She couldn't believe it, because that man was truly an incredibly powerful awakened one, and the spider was definitely suffering from several impacts and piercings. It was then that the protagonist raised his hands and with a single strike managed to sever several of the spider's legs, and that level 8 beast simply fell to the ground while the protagonist walked calmly before its eyes, and from his hands a kind of red orb began to form. He thanked it because the battle had been quite fun, and then used that orb to make the spider explode completely from the inside out. In the process, he also ended up retrieving that magic stone. That would be the compensation for making him waste so much time in this place. But he felt something strange coming from that stone. Magic stones contain the impurity created by powers, but he felt the same thing when he defeated that weak dragon, including the fact that this spider was a fallen god, so it shouldn't have impurities within its body. Perhaps it was because of the contract that this fallen god had made with someone else. At that moment, around Nuri, several awakened ones appeared, threatening them. That was Kaharu's doing, saying that a weak country like theirs could never help them, and that she would now eliminate them for underestimating her. And Nuri simply saw that this girl was truly ungrateful, and Lee Yujin asked if that was serious. After all, she was attacking the ones who had just saved her, and Koharu was doing it out of arrogance since her country was far more powerful. And to Nuri, that was ridiculous. They had come there to provide protection to this place. But Koharu wanted to do this to maintain her nation's reputation, saying she didn't need the intervention of damned foreigners to help. She ordered the awakened ones to attack those two. She knew that without that S-class they would never survive this assault. But Nuri looked up to the skies and the protagonist arrived at that exact moment. And when he landed, he caused such a massive impact that everything around lifted into the air. The men wondered where that man had come from and had to shield themselves from the flying debris. Koharu asked what that was, but when she looked at that person she realized it was Tai, the same man who had fought the spider alone, and he said he was quite offended by what they were doing now. Koharu believed the protagonist had been killed by all that poison, and Lee Yujin explained that they had tried to save that awakened girl, but after everything ended, all those people around were trying to kill the two of them, and the protagonist asked if they were really trying to harm his people. And with those words and that pressure, all the awakened ones began to fall to the ground, completely powerless. What they were seeing before them was practically an untamed demon. One of the men told Koharu to get out of there because that S-class was impossible to stop. But she said no because reinforcements were already arriving, and with so many people that man wouldn't be able to fight. She ordered them to fight. They needed to buy some time. The protagonist said that those who wanted to leave were free to do so, but he would obliterate from existence anyone who pointed a weapon in his direction. But Nuri quickly stepped in front of him. He didn't need to do something so extreme against such insignificant people. She turned to the others, stating that their mission there was to save people, not destroy each other. And if it weren't for her master, everyone there would already be dead, and many civilians would have been wiped out in the process. And Lee Yujin asked if the girl really cared that much about the people around them, while the protagonist was staring at the blonde once again. It was interesting to see the actions she took as his subordinate. Then he proposed a duel between his subordinate and one of the Japanese awakened ones. He wouldn't interfere, risking his own name. The awakened man there said that Koharu didn't need to take part. She could use him for the duel. After all, he wouldn't be defeated by any awakened one from around the world just to defend her. It was impressive that they would duel just to show which country was stronger. Pretty foolish, especially in a war scene like that. But it could be overlooked. Lee Yujin faced it with tension because that man seemed to be quite powerful, a katana user. Koharu was also anxious while the protagonist wanted to see the results of his subordinate's training. Thus Nuri stepped forward with her two massive blades, and half a second later she vanished from sight. Then several sword clashes echoed, and she passed straight through that other awakened one. Nuri got a small cut on her face while the Japanese awakened stood still for a moment. But that was a lie. He spat blood and fell to the ground. And she enjoyed that quite a bit. After all, there was no way that girl could lose. Thus she emerged victorious from that clash, while Koharu couldn't believe that Brat had defeated one of her own. The protagonist laughed. His subordinate had really improved a lot, and as part of the promise he would let Koharu go. But she remained indignant, screaming that those inferior foreigners couldn't insult them, and that she would make them regret it. When the rest of the reinforcements arrived, she ordered the elimination of that Korean group, and Lee Yujin simply thought that girl was truly an idiot. Meanwhile, the protagonist ruffled the blonde's hair, saying that she had done very well. She was getting stronger every day thanks to her training, and told her not to worry because he wouldn't use his sword to deal with trash like them. Then from his hands he created a kind of crimson whirlwind filled with hatred and blood, and the awakened ones were horrified to see so much power building up. And Koharu also stood there, mouth wide open. Then a gigantic explosion happened on that street, sending all the awakened ones flying. And little by little the protagonist absorbed that power back again, until it vanished. Until finally, with the snap of his fingers, the entire region around them was completely obliterated, and from that moment on there was nothing left to see there, and they had to return. The girls were a little downcast after everything that had happened, and Lee Yujin, after all that, was content and satisfied to be on the same side as Tai. The next day, the news of that level 8 monster's appearance was revealed to the world. 2 million people had been eliminated, as well as a large portion of the Japanese awakened ones. The Japanese government apologized and also thanked Korea for its help. And there at the protagonist's house, the manager arrived with a large box. It was a message from the Japanese minister. It seemed to be a gift, and he placed it right in front of them. It was the Arctic Ice Spear, a named treasure that came from Japan. And Nori was delighted to see this item. She had never seen anything so powerful. But for the protagonist, that item had no use at all, other than chilling his soda, and he told the manager to relay the message that the minister should send him something to eat instead of a useless item. But he ended up noticing something approaching and told the manager to prepare, because someone was coming to the island. And indeed, in a small boat not far away, Zay was arriving and wanted to meet again with that S-rank awakened who was shaking the world. He knew he was risking his life at that moment to meet this man. The manager explained that those people outside were from the guild, and were requesting a meeting with Tai. The protagonist would receive them. After all, he could see they were unarmed. And besides, there was no one stronger than him in this world. He was curious to see who had come to invade his property, and ordered everyone to prepare to receive the visitors. And the group that arrived was completely terrified, because the aura the protagonist emanated was definitely that of a demon lord. It was far more powerful than any rank they had ever encountered before, and the protagonist asked what the purpose of their visit was. Thus, they went to the meeting room, and the manager was offering them some hot chocolate, while Zay trembled in fear upon feeling the aura that rank exuded. And once again, the protagonist told him to be quick. He had no time to waste, because his soap opera was about to start soon. And Zay was stammering until he stood up, bowed and hit his head on the floor, begging Taeying to accept the guild's invitation, but it was immediately refused. Thus we moved to the Awakened Association. The man there was reviewing some data about the guild, and the leader of that guild, in this case, Zay, was a very weak man, but they definitely had to pay attention to him. That was because from now on that man was involved with the guild, and when they said that man, they meant the protagonist, and the man was completely shocked when he remembered that person and demanded more information. That was because Zay had been searching for an S rank to join his guild, and once he discovered where the protagonist lived, he decided to go there, arriving at that island off the west coast. And it seemed he had gone there the night before to talk with the great, crazy S rank, and the man simply thought that Zay must be insane for meeting with such an arrogant S rank. He ordered them to gather more information. He wanted to know why they were trying to recruit Taeying, and he still wondered why on earth someone with such a high rank would want to hire someone with such a low rank for this. But if he managed to recruit him into his guild, the association could suffer heavy losses. As he placed his hand over his mouth, he merely mentioned that maybe he'd have to do it, and began calling someone, saying he had business to discuss from now on and would also have a very well-paid job for them. And the person on the other end of the line was just waiting to hear the price of it all. Back to Zay, who was still bowed, trying to convince the protagonist to join his guild, and after being refused he asked why, saying he only wanted a justification, and Taeying replied that he was simply useless, so there was no reason to join his guild. It was the same as being an insect in front of him, and yet he had the audacity to invade his house to make such a low offer, and also because he hated wasting time. While he continued sipping his hot chocolate, Zay didn't want to return empty-handed. It was his first time seeing Tai, but he was so oppressive that he just shouted that it wasn't true, that awakened ones always fought against death, and the guild could greatly favor Tai's growth. He was practically begging for the protagonist to join his guild, promising he could do whatever he wanted. The protagonist gave a mischievous smile, asking again if they truly meant anything, and now things were getting interesting, so he would give them a chance. Zay asked what he desired while lowering his head. The chance was that the man would have to prove his usefulness and skill. The mission was simple, to completely eliminate the guild of the Awakened Society. Then the next day, when they returned home, Zay was still thinking about what had happened, because if Taeying didn't join the guild, they had no future. And to defeat one of the three great guilds would be very difficult, but that was the price they needed to pay to recruit the protagonist. And at home, Nori asked why he had given that order to those men. Honestly, he had no specific reason. She complained, saying that the Awakened Society was a guild composed of thousands of awakened ones. Even Lee Yujin found that request strange. And the protagonist honestly wasn't expecting Zay to complete that request. He was running a small test with him to see if he could be useful in the future. After all, he couldn't just go around showing kindness to others. He asked Nori if she had forgotten what the Guild of the Awakened Society had done. They were in that battle, the one that took away his only love in this world. So besides that guild he had crushed at the beginning of the story, there was also the society that he wished to completely obliterate. Nori could feel that pain, that hatred, and that anguish, since they were connected by the pact. Lee Yujin once again didn't understand what had happened, because she had never known the protagonist's story. Thus, we go to another building. Zay was also there, standing before Sela, the leader of the Valkyrie clan. It seemed that Zay had been very busy trying to contact the three largest guilds. Sela didn't like getting involved in the games of such a lowly person, but after everything he explained, she was somewhat interested in the plan, especially after hearing that he had visited the new S-Class Awakened. And Zay just lowered his head, knowing he was in deep trouble. How could that information have already leaked to the major clans? But Sela said it was fine, because her guild had been founded to protect the country, not to commit acts of vandalism or crimes like the others. But at that moment, she was curious to know what kind of deal Zay had made with that S-Rank Awakened, and she was trying to imagine whether Zay's little games would make that S-Rank the target of all Korea. And he swallowed hard, because it seemed his plans were being exposed, so he began to explain better, while around them several guards stood watch. Back at home, Nuri was training like Zoro, and also lifting weights so huge that I had never seen anything like them in my life. At that moment, her phone started ringing, and it was Zay's voice, but she looked worried, and the protagonist ended up taking the phone from her hand, wondering what was happening on the other side. Because if we go back to Zay and his little group leaving that cafe in frustration, right behind them someone appeared, asking if he was the guild leader. And when they turned around, even Sela, who was still inside the cafe, widened her eyes completely, because a massive explosion went off right there in the street. And the man was laughing in his office, wondering how that bastard dared to stab him in the back and join that damned S-rank. The protagonist was watching on his phone some news about an attack that had occurred in the capital, and the victims were members of the guild. And the protagonist simply smiled, saying that they were proving themselves, and that now he would agree to join the guild. Meanwhile, we moved to an airplane, and stepping out of it was our little group. That was because they had told the director that the protagonist was going to completely destroy the Guild of the Awakened Society. And Serena reported that the protagonist had joined the guild, and they were attacked, but Sela had managed to intervene and save the people who were there. Kang informed that the guild leader would be recovering in the hospital, but the problem was that now Tai was controlling that entire guild, and the director couldn't believe it. It seemed to be a shock for all of them, and it was reported that the ones responsible for the attack were from the society. The director asked if that was really true, but then realized something, that probably all of this was part of a bigger plan, for Tai to use it as an excuse to destroy the Awakened Society as vengeance. And they were in the car being driven by a chauffeur. The protagonist wanted to go to the Valkyrie Guild to see what had happened that day, and his subordinates only looked on with worry. Nuri tried to talk to her master, and he already knew what she was going to say, that not all awakened ones in that place were bad. But that didn't mean he would simply ignore the fact that his grandmother had been killed by those groups. Still, he wouldn't just go in there and eliminate everyone. He was planning something different. He was planning to bring the Awakened Society under his control and use them as well. He would have a word with the leader of the Valkyrie clan to see what had happened. He needed to confirm that from now on the plans could no longer fail, and hope that at least the people in charge of those guilds would be useful to him. Our guy's delegation arrived at the Valkyrie building, and inside everyone was anxious, waiting for the S-rank awakened. But Sela told everyone to calm down, because it seemed Tai had come for a negotiation, not to destroy the place. Thus the protagonist and his group arrived there, and it seemed they were going to negotiate. That was why everyone who wasn't a combatant had been evacuated. The protagonist asked if that girl was responsible for the Valkyrie Guild, and while she confirmed it, he began reading her attributes. It was clear that her skills and stats were at least within the A-rank range, and considering the rare abilities she possessed, she might be useful. She explained what had happened with Zay, that he was investigating the major guilds, and the protagonist revealed the name of the guild, making the girl tremble. After all, it was that same guild that the protagonist had obliterated about 20 chapters ago. She just lowered her head, because that place had been turned into a bloodbath for a simple act of revenge. She stated that the Valkyrie Guild had nothing to do with the situation that led to his grandmother's death. Then the protagonist ordered her to explain herself from now on. Then she explained that the Valkyrie Guild had indeed appeared that day, but to save people, and according to the investigations, they were connected with the man from the Awakened Society as well. They tried to protest against the union of those two, but it was practically impossible with the strength they had. And the worst part was that if the Awakened Society collapsed, probably all of the country's protection would collapse too, because they had countless awakened ones under their wings. But in any case, they never supported Yin's guild. However, the protagonist asked if her silence also aligned with that. He said that mere complacency, staying silent and doing nothing, didn't solve any problems. And from now on, Sila would also bear responsibility, as one of the 3 great guilds. Seeing that she wouldn't be able to negotiate with the protagonist, she began to conjure her power, ordering her subordinates to stop him. But the man simply extended his hands and grabbed Sila by the neck, while the bald one with the huge axe was suddenly intercepted by Nuri, who blocked his weapon and immediately landed a kick in his stomach, sending him flying. She was already in her draconic form and completely stopped the advance of the mage in that group. The protagonist praised that the people around her were truly brave, but to him this was already personal. He would fulfill his vengeance against those people. While crying, Sila tried to negotiate at least for her own life, and begged that the other members of her guild be spared. There was no need to hurt them all. She would carry all that burden on her shoulders. Nuri just stared at her master while he said that such a request was meaningless. Thus we moved to the society's headquarters, and there the man was with his secretary, extremely irritated by the news he had just received, while his phone wouldn't stop ringing. And the moment he answered, he was harshly insulted by the person on the other end, who said that things were now getting complicated because the target he had ordered to be eliminated before was now causing even more chaos, and things were about to get very difficult. Also, because the target had changed, now it was the headquarters of the society. The man trembled in fear upon hearing that. Thus he also ordered the person on the other end of the line to come there and protect him. But the person only laughed, saying that was impossible, especially with the attitude the man had been showing toward them. But he would give him a little discount if he requested it respectfully. The man just threw his phone on the floor in sheer rage and ordered all guild members to be summoned and prepared for battle. The secretary went to carry out those orders while the man began to shake in fear, but then smiled because that S-class wasn't immortal, and he would use all his strength to fight our man. Sila was also in that car, completely stunned because just a few minutes ago, when she was being choked midair, she had been dropped to the ground. The protagonist liked her attitude, and from now on the Valkyrie Guild would be under his wings as well, and she would have to follow all his orders, and the current order was to attack the base of the Awakened Society. After all, that society had been completely consumed by corruption. He knew it wouldn't be easy to obliterate them all, but the criminals would be punished today. He simply ordered them to watch from afar whatever he was about to do and to do as they pleased. Sila found that strange, but even so she agreed, and the driver warned that they had to stop now because the street ahead was blocked. Right in front of them, hundreds of awakened ones were waiting. It seemed that the entire awakened society had been summoned. Once again, he told his subordinates not to get involved, because this revenge was solely and exclusively his. The awakened ones saw the S rank approaching and ordered everyone to attack him with all they had, but the protagonist simply walked calmly, sending people flying into the air. While inside the society, the man was watching it all, and the guy behind him wasn't all that impressed with Korea's new S rank. He seemed quite different from what he had heard, because at that level the man would probably be able to handle all of this alone. But of course the man just shouted that they couldn't possibly deal with that monster right now. That's why they were paying an additional fee for him to fight. From below the building, a man had been thrown out. The protagonist was getting pretty tired because all of them were weaklings, and Scylla was astonished that this man had managed to defeat practically all the members of that society. It seemed she had made the right choice cooperating with him. Nuri was also happy because it seemed her master wasn't killing everyone, just leaving them unconscious, but the protagonist stopped advancing, then ordered his subordinates to stay behind. That was when a gigantic fireball crossed the path. Scylla had to freeze a barrier to protect everyone there, and the protagonist took that hit head on, but it didn't even tickle him. Meanwhile, the person coming out of the building laughed, saying that man really did look powerful, and the protagonist looked right back at him. He knew that this other man was strong, and the blonde guy was pleased to meet the S rank of Korea. His name was Dylan from the guild. He was also an S rank, and the others just glanced at each other asking who the hell that guy was. But Dylan was declaring the protagonist's elimination right there, and the protagonist only looked at him with an expression of sadness and boredom. Once again, the others were wondering what another order was. Nuri tried to recall the name, but they didn't know what it was. And Scylla had already heard of that name. It was the name of a guild that appeared when catastrophes struck the world. It was a secret group of awakened ones that existed only in rumors, and their power was terrifying. And it seemed that the man had direct contact with those people, and he had brought one of them to the battle. It seemed he must have paid a lot to gain support from the Noder, and the man was laughing because Taehyung wasn't the only S rank in the world. But Dylan looked at him, wondering why Taehyung wasn't reacting dramatically, like saying, wow, he's also an S rank. But the protagonist simply confirmed it, like, yeah, you're an S rank. Congratulations, man. Our guy was seeing all the stats of that man, and he seemed to be a follower of a certain person. And while he walked toward him, the opponent replied that he had no authority to decree his elimination. After all, Dylan was also quite weak. Taehyung himself simply told the man to get out of there, because things were about to get very dangerous. But the director of the society wanted to see that bastard fall into Dylan's hands, and the blonde turned, telling the man to leave immediately, or else he'd be eliminated right now. And the man felt the pressure and broke into a cold sweat. Then he just ran away, cursing everyone. Dylan called our man arrogant as he channeled a kind of pink flame. The protagonist also ordered all his subordinates to stay away, because those flames seemed quite dangerous. Dylan summoned hellfire from his hands, and a terrifying demonic-looking power rushed toward the protagonist, who was impressed that the man was using 6th rank magic so quickly. The power was almost at the level of 7th rank magic, and the girls could feel the pressure of all that energy and fire. The temperature was so high that it cooked everything around. Even the concrete and the lampposts were melting. Scylla couldn't believe such magical power existed. But why was Taehyung laughing in the middle of all that fire? Dylan just thought that guy must be insane, but that he shouldn't underestimate his own S-rank power, as he summoned even more hellfire in his other hand. This time the protagonist even widened his eyes, seeing so much power being combined. A tornado of fire surrounded our guy, cooking everything. While Dylan struggled to control all that power in his hands, suddenly all the flames were dissipated, and the entire neighborhood shook from the impact. Dylan just apologized to the society's director, saying it looked like they'd have to rebuild the whole building after it was cooked by his flames. Then he conjured another fiery magic circle. This time it exploded right where the protagonist was, along with the entire society building, and as he saw the whole building burning, he burst into laughter, saying that no S-class opponent was a match for him. The man was nervous watching his building on fire, while the subordinates stared with worry because that flame was really melting concrete. They had never seen such powerful fire before. Nuri was worried about the people who couldn't evacuate, thinking the battle would probably drag on a bit longer, but they didn't need to worry about their master, because he was fine. And from the middle of all that blaze, another small explosion occurred, and suddenly all that pink fire began to be absorbed, and Dylan looked worried about it. In the midst of the flames, the protagonist praised him, saying that fire was truly impressive, but compared to his own elemental power, this was nothing more than a faint ember. While he absorbed all that power into an orb in his hands, Dylan gritted his teeth watching it as the protagonist refined all that elemental energy into a kind of spear, and the man stared in horror, trembling because all that power was returning toward him. Then he saw his final moments approaching, and a gigantic explosion occurred inside the building, completely tearing through it. Those flames could be seen from the sky above the capital, while Kang and Serena were terrified to see such overwhelming power. It seemed they were arriving too late, and Serena knew that if they reached the scene they probably couldn't do anything. No one could stop Ty's strength, and in front of Dylan he saw the entire building destroyed. He was nervous because his client had been eliminated, and the protagonist simply said that the moment of his vengeance was coming to an end and asked Dylan if they could have a bit more fun. Of course the man felt provoked, and then summoned even more firepower, throwing it all toward the protagonist, but Taking easily dodged it and even gave the power a little tap. That enraged Dylan, who kept hurling his fire powers. Then he cast Hellfire once again in the protagonist's direction, and that power was getting closer and closer, until it completely exploded where our guy was standing. And Dylan smiled, but immediately after, like a petty villain, he grew frustrated, because the protagonist caught that power directly in his hands, praising that the fire was indeed very hot. And Dylan didn't know what to do, because he had already used all his attacks. How was that possible? What kind of being was Tai? And the protagonist simply said that he was the mage type. That was impossible for Dylan. How could a mage type withstand that much fire? He just lowered his head. How could his power be so useless against this man? And it was just as Tai expected. That was how demons showed the difference in power before greater enemies. They never hesitated to face them, but humans simply lowered their heads when confronted with a much greater challenge. But Dylan was actually smiling and apologized for underestimating his opponent while conjuring more flames in his hands. He would finally be able to unleash all his strength against an opponent who wouldn't be eliminated so easily. And the protagonist praised him, saying that was the right spirit, and told Dylan to entertain him even more. The protagonist noticed that the ground was beginning to crack, and around him, the flames were growing stronger. This fire was even burning his clothes. He realized that this fire was far more powerful than before. These were the flames of suppression, and our guy had to prepare himself to receive the attack, but found it strange that nothing was coming. Then Dylan told him to wait, because he was still channeling his volcano. That way, a gigantic dragon appeared before the protagonist, and several smaller serpent heads emerged from beneath it. These were the tricks and flames Dylan had up his sleeve. Right above, several sharp flame blades were rushing in his direction. The protagonist faced all that power, and then a gigantic explosion shook the entire region. The subordinates looked at that scene with concern. After all, when Dylan used that ability, no enemy was left alive. But they noticed that he was holding back the attack's power, like he was literally grabbing it with his bare hands and cutting through it with the other. And those flames that had been rising from below became completely stable. The mana around the protagonist was far more terrifying now, and Dylan asked how. How could he not have caused even a scratch? Because not even his attack worked to eliminate the protagonist. With another strike, he sent another wave toward our man, who simply raised his hand, and with an extremely sharp blow using his bare hands destroyed that entire formation of flames coming from Dylan's direction, and also cut him in half. And once again Dylan asked how, since he hadn't even seen what happened. The protagonist simply stepped on Dylan's chest while he was on the ground, and the poor man was already coughing up blood as the protagonist just watched his suffering, knowing that he was about to die. After all, the man had also lost both arms in that attack. He told Dylan to put those arms back on. He should use regeneration magic to make things more entertaining. But you could see in Dylan's eyes that he had already reached his limit. The protagonist just sighed at that. He had hoped that at least Dylan could entertain him a little more. So he summoned his demonic arms and decided to give Dylan a gift, to call upon his true magic power to finish him off. While the girls listened to Dylan begging for his life, but unfortunately in this world the protagonist couldn't use his true magic. After all, there wasn't enough mana here to use his spells. So the protagonist punched the man in front of him with an explosive blow, and Scylla just turned her face away so she wouldn't have to see it. The protagonist literally obliterated the man, and in the end Dylan was nothing more than a puddle of blood on the ground. By the time the people from the association arrived, they realized there was nothing they could do. After all, the society's building had been destroyed. And since everything was now so quiet, Serena believed that it was finally over. They were happy that, at least, it ended without too many victims. Gloria quickly went to meet with her teammates and apologized for what had happened, saying that now they would take full responsibility for the destruction of that place. But they asked who Taning had been fighting to cause such devastation, and reported that they had found an S-rank awakened there. But for Kang, that was impossible, because there were only a few awakened ones around the world, and all S-ranks were under the control of the national leadership. Then he revealed that the man's name was Dylan, from a group called Another. Scylla ordered everything that had happened there to be reported to the directors. After all, they had just destroyed the awakened society, and from now on they needed to rebuild a special task force to continue protecting the country. Thus we go to the association's building, and the director received the information that the Noter was active. Scylla explained about this group, but the director knew them very well. Only a few people in the higher ranks knew about the existence of the Noter. They had already appeared in several other countries, causing destruction wherever they went. It was a terrorist group that extorted people in exchange for protection. The protagonist just called those guys incompetent, while Scylla said that the incident that happened today should be kept confidential, especially because the man had been killed on the way, and the awakened society had been completely dismantled. They should announce that the man was part of an enemy group and that Taeding had gone there to resolve the situation, thus ensuring national security. The protagonist gave a small laugh. It seemed that everything was going according to plan. On the other side, we were taken to several great halls, where it was reported that Dylan had been eliminated. But many there just laughed, thinking it must be a joke. Yet one of the women confirmed that it was true. He had been eliminated and a general shock spread through the room. How could that possibly be true? Then they reported that he had been eliminated directly in Korea. That was strange because Dylan was stronger than most of them there. So they asked what had really happened in his mission. They even sent Gandharva to inspect what had happened in Korea after finishing his own task. And that old man was laughing as he agreed to do it. Then we returned to the present moment, where a massive portal was forming in the skies above the capital. It seemed that Gandharva was eager to meet our protagonist. And on the other side, that little portal was still forming. People found it strange that the protagonist was so calm. He was completely at ease near a portal being created, while his subordinates were already there, ready for battle. Scylla also appeared, saying that they didn't need to be so tense, but Nuri said she wasn't nervous, claiming she was strong enough for real battles. But the biggest problem was that each portal brought an enemy even stronger than the last. But Nuri was calm. That was because she had her master by their side, and they were discussing what kind of name their little group should have from now on. And the two girls were trying to decide the best name for the group, but it seemed like a completely silly and stupid discussion. She suggested the Untouchables. After all, no one could hurt the master and they liked that name, though it was honestly pretty ugly, and they presented it to the master as Team Untouchable. But the protagonist just lowered his head in agreement. It seemed he didn't like it either. It was at that moment that they heard the sound of that portal, and the mana around it was accumulating even more. It seemed it was time to get serious again. Then everyone widened their eyes. The protagonist also stood up, facing the portal. In any case, Nuri didn't need to worry, not with the protagonist there. Then he simply shouted for everyone to prepare for battle. And that portal was nothing to them, but people started running when they saw what was coming out of it. That was because once again, two completely red arms began to emerge. It was a red-horned being, once again a level 6 enemy, but he found that power strange, and when checking his nitrics, that monster was level 7. Everyone was startled because they had already seen a very similar monster before, and this huge creature stood in front of our protagonist. He really must have been the twin of the other one that appeared a few months ago. They named him Red Dragon too, and Nuri was quite happy. After all, her master had already defeated one of them. What was one more? And now they were curious to see what Taein would do against that beast, who quickly raised its leg to crush the protagonist. And everyone's eyes widened. But the dragon realized it hadn't crushed anything at all, because the protagonist was standing right there. And Taein asked if by any chance it had used resurrection, because facing two of them was already strange, but either way he was quite satisfied. After all, he would be able to exert his strength once again. Then he positioned himself and leapt to land a direct hit on the monster. He just needed to break it once again, but after the first punch, the monster became completely enraged, and the protagonist told it to lower those eyes while running across its head with his leg, and a kick came down from above. That must have hurt a lot, because the monster was dizzy. It couldn't even keep up with the protagonist's speed, who quickly grabbed the dragon's tail. A kind of electricity began flowing from the protagonist directly into the monster's tail, and he threw the beast right into the middle of the street. The poor thing was getting beaten up without even seeing where the attacks were coming from. Then it fixed its gaze once again on the protagonist. However, Taein was pulling his sword from his inventory. The girls were watching without even blinking. Once again, the protagonist admitted that he liked magic much more, but unfortunately he had to use swords. And once again the group was outraged to hear that. Then he suggested to everyone that the team's name wouldn't be the Untouchables, but instead the Mages. And the dragon at that moment was breathing more scorching flames, but the protagonist swiftly passed through them with his sharp blade. Yeah, it was quite strange. The protagonist was choosing the team's name while fighting. Nuri just clapped her hands and told everyone to pay attention, because the portal they were going to use for training, unfortunately had closed, and now they needed to collect the rewards that the dragon had dropped on the ground, while the protagonist simply walked away from the beast. And that's where we'll stop for now, everyone. I wanted to keep going, but unfortunately the author hasn't released new chapters yet. But if you liked the story, leave it in the comments so we can bring you much more soon. That's it for today. See you next time, everyone.